A whole generation of Americans sprayed a substance in their homes that was later judged a probable carcinogen. It lined nursery walls, wiped down kitchens, and the ads swore it was perfectly safe for every member of the family. In 1972, that substance was banned for its harm to the environment and to human health. But here's the detail almost nobody mentions when that well-known story gets told. Before that miracle product arrived, homes were guarded by 3 cheap things from an ordinary shop. Those 3 things cannot be patented, and no monthly contract has ever been built on top of them. That is exactly why a generation was convinced their grandmother's methods were something to be embarrassed about. Today, the average family pays hundreds of dollars a year in service contracts and still lives alongside insects. Yet, in old farmhouses full of gaps, loose thresholds, and fields pressed against the back porch, that bill simply does not exist. Now comes the full picture: what these 3 things are, how each one works, and why the science behind every one of them holds up today. Picture a woman in a suburb of Chicago sitting at her kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, signing the same quarterly pest control contract she has signed every 3 months for the past 6 years. The paper is familiar, the amount is familiar, and the insects that appear each spring are equally familiar, arriving on schedule as though they too have read the contract. According to industry estimates published by the National Pest Management Association, the professional pest control market in the United States generates revenues in the range of $23 to $26 billion annually. That figure is not an abstraction pulled from a single bad year, but a consistent range across multiple reporting cycles, and it reflects a market built almost entirely on recurring household subscriptions rather than one-time solutions. The average American household spending on a standard recurring pest control contract runs between $300 and $500 per year, depending on region, property size, and the specific package selected. That is money spent not to eliminate a problem permanently, but to manage it on a rolling basis, which is a meaningfully different proposition, and one that the contract language rarely makes explicit. Now set that figure against the arithmetic of an old Pennsylvania farmhouse where a family has lived for 4 generations without a single pest control invoice in the filing cabinet. The house is not sealed by modern standards. The window frames have settled. The back door has a gap at the threshold wide enough to slide a coin through. By every measure that a contemporary pest inspector would apply, it should be losing the battle badly. What that farmhouse has instead of a contract is a practice. 3 inexpensive materials applied at every entry point, refreshed seasonally, and understood by every adult in the household as a basic maintenance task in the same category as oiling a hinge or banking a fire. The total annual cost of those 3 materials, purchased in quantity sufficient for a full farmhouse, runs to somewhere between $15 and $30 depending on the source and the size of the property. The contrast between $300 and $15 is already striking enough on its own, but the more important contrast is the one in outcome. The farmhouse with the gap under the door and the fields right outside the kitchen window is not losing to insects. The suburban house with the quarterly contract and the sealed weather stripping is spending money continuously without arriving at a different result. That asymmetry is not an accident, and it is not explained by cleanliness or tidiness, because the farmhouse is neither more sealed nor more sterile than the suburban home. What the farmhouse has that the suburban home does not is a method that addresses the entry point itself rather than responding to insects that have already come inside. The quarterly spray targets a population that has already established itself in the structure. The old farmhouse method intercepts that population before it crosses the threshold, and it does so using mechanisms that have not changed and cannot be made obsolete, because they are not chemical in the way a synthetic pesticide is chemical. Extension literature from the University of Minnesota and Colorado State has documented each of these mechanisms in accessible language available to any gardener or homeowner. None of it is hidden. None of it requires a specialist to apply. The reason it is not the default advice handed out at every hardware counter in the country has very little to do with its effectiveness, and a great deal to do with the economics of the pest control industry, which will become clearer once the 1940s enter this story. For now, the single most important thing to hold in mind is this: The gap between what the farmhouse spends and what the suburban household spends is not explained by luck, geography, or building quality. It is explained by knowledge, specifically by knowledge that was common property before a particular era of advertising made it feel outdated, what that advertising was selling and what it eventually cost the people who used it, is a story that belongs later in this account. First, there is the question of why the old house with all its gaps should, by any logical standard, have more insects than it does, and why the answer to that question is stranger and more interesting than it first appears. Stand at the back door of a farmhouse built in rural Ohio sometime around 1910 and look at it honestly, the way a structural inspector would. The threshold has a visible gap. The door frame has pulled slightly away from the wall where the house settled over decades. Two of the window sashes on the ground floor no longer sit flush, and the cellar access is a wooden hatch that fits its frame the way a lid fits a pot that has been dropped several times. By every standard that modern pest-proofing literature applies, this house is an open invitation. Contemporary guidance from the University of Minnesota Extension identifies gaps around doors and windows, cracks in foundation walls, and spaces around utility penetrations as the primary entry routes for household insects. This farmhouse has all of them, and it has had all of them for longer than most suburban houses have existed. The fields begin roughly 30 feet from the back porch. In late summer, those fields hold grasshoppers, ground beetles, ants in numbers that are genuinely difficult to estimate, and the full complement of insects that accompany grain storage and harvest. The pressure on the exterior of that house from the insect population surrounding it is not low. It is, by any ecological measure, substantially higher than the pressure on a house set in a residential neighborhood with mown lawns and paved driveways. Yet, the people who live in that farmhouse are not fighting an indoor insect problem. The kitchen is not overrun. The pantry is not compromised. The cellar, despite its imperfect hatch, does not have the roach population that a similar space in an urban apartment building accumulates within months of going untreated. Something is working, and it is not the building envelope, because the building envelope is, by contemporary standards, failing. Here is where the paradox sharpens into something genuinely instructive. The assumption built into modern pest proofing is that the primary defense is the seal, that if you close every gap, insects cannot enter. That assumption is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because sealing is a passive strategy that depends entirely on the integrity of a barrier that weathering, settling, and seasonal expansion and contraction will work against continuously. A house that relies solely on its seal is a house that is always one winter away from a new entry point. The old farmhouse operates on a different assumption entirely. Rather than trying to make the building impermeable, which a century of settling has made impossible anyway, it treats the entry point itself as a zone of consequence. Every threshold, every doorframe seam, every gap around a window sash is not merely a structural defect to be patched, but a location where a prepared surface can intercept any insect that attempts to cross it. The insect does not need to be kept out by a physical wall if it cannot survive the journey across the treated zone. This distinction matters because it reframes what counts as a vulnerability. A gap under a door is not a failure in this system. It is, in a certain sense, a controlled passage, one that any insect crossing will encounter the prepared surface on both sides of. The farmhouse does not need to win the architectural argument. It cannot win. It wins a different argument, a biological and chemical one, at the point of entry rather than at the point of detection. The skeptic's instinct when hearing about old farmhouse methods is to reach for the tidiness explanation, to assume that the absence of insects reflects an absence of food sources, better housekeeping, or simply lower insect pressure in a rural area. The food source argument collapses immediately in a working farmhouse where grain, preserved food, and animal feed are present in quantities that would constitute a significant infestation risk in any urban setting. The rural pressure argument, as noted, runs in the opposite direction of what the tidiness theory predicts. What remains, once those comfortable explanations are set aside, is the method itself, and specifically the logic of layering three distinct mechanisms at the entry point so that an insect encountering the threshold encounters not one obstacle, but 3, each working by a different principle, each covering a gap that the others leave open. Understanding why that layering works requires understanding each component separately, starting with the oldest and strangest of the 3. A dust mined from underground deposits that was already millions of years old before the farmhouse was built, and that will work exactly the same way millions of years from now. Every entry point in a well-maintained old farmhouse, every door threshold, every windowsill edge, every gap where a pipe enters a wall from outside, carries 3 things applied in a specific sequence, with a specific logic behind each one. The people who applied them did not always know the mechanism in the language that a university extension bulletin would use today. But they knew the outcome, which was that the insects that pressed against the outside of the house in enormous numbers did not establish themselves inside it. The 3 things are diatomaceous earth, boric acid, and dried bay leaf. Each one is available today at a hardware store or a grocery supplier for a price that would not trouble a household budget in any meaningful way. None of them requires a license to purchase or apply. None of them demands specialized equipment. Together, they represent a system whose individual components are each documented in peer-reviewed literature, extension service publications, and Environmental Protection Agency registration records, which is a stronger evidentiary foundation than most products sold under a pest control brand name can claim. What makes the 3-part system more than a collection of folk remedies placed together by habit is that each component operates by a genuinely different mechanism. They do not do the same thing by different roads. They do categorically different things, and those differences are precisely what makes their combination more effective than any single one of them applied alone. A repellent that keeps insects from approaching an entry point does not help once an insect has already crossed it. A physical barrier that destroys insects on contact does not reach the colony that sent the forager. A slow-acting substance carried back to a nest addresses a problem that neither the repellent nor the physical barrier can touch. Each mechanism will be explained in detail in the sections that follow, and each explanation will rest on documented science rather than on tradition alone. The resistance argument for the first ingredient is particularly striking, and deserves to be held in mind as a contrast with everything the synthetic pesticide era promised and then failed to deliver. A chemical insecticide creates selection pressure on the insect population it targets, meaning that the individuals who survive a chemical application are, by definition, those with the greatest natural resistance to it, and their offspring inherit that resistance. Within a small number of generations, the chemical that once worked stops working entirely. The first of the 3 ingredients does not work chemically. It works physically in a way that an insect's biology cannot adapt to across any number of generations, because the problem it creates for the insect is not a matter of metabolizing a toxin, but of maintaining the structural integrity of its outer layer against a material that is harder than that layer. No evolutionary pathway leads from "my exoskeleton is being abraded by sharp mineral particles" to "my descendants are immune to being abraded by sharp mineral particles." The physics does not change, and the insect cannot change the physics. That single fact, that one ingredient in a recipe used in old farmhouses for generations, operates by a mechanism that synthetic chemistry has never been able to replicate or improve upon, is worth sitting with for a moment before moving forward. The pest control industry that grew up in the post-war decades sold the promise of chemistry as the answer to every insect problem. The chemistry worked for a while against the insects that could not adapt to it until those insects adapted. The dust in the old farmhouse did not face that problem because the dust was never working chemically in the first place. The second ingredient works at the colony level, which is a scale of operation that no contact spray can match. A contact spray eliminates the forager it touches. The second ingredient lets the forager live long enough to return to the colony, share what it has ingested with workers, larvae, and the reproductive individuals at the center of the nest, and only then begin to act. The delay that makes a contact spray user feel cheated, wondering why the product is not working immediately, is precisely the property that makes the second ingredient capable of collapsing an entire colony rather than simply reducing the number of foragers visible at the surface. The third ingredient does not kill at all in the way the first 2 do, and presenting it as a lethal agent would be misleading. It is a perimeter influence, a signal carried in the volatile compounds released by dried bay leaves that the olfactory systems of a wide range of household insects read as a reason to approach a different entry point on a different building entirely. Its role in the system is not to destroy, but to redirect. And that distinction matters because it explains where in the layered application it belongs, at the outermost edge of the treated zone, rather than at the interior threshold. What the three ingredients create together, when applied in sequence at every entry point a house possesses, is a situation in which an insect approaching from outside first encounters a chemical signal advising it to turn away. Then, if it continues regardless, crosses a physical barrier with lethal consequences for its outer layer, and finally, if it survives both of those encounters and makes contact with the food or surfaces inside, carries a slow-acting substance back to the colony that sent it. No single stage of that sequence is infallible. The system's strength is that each stage catches what the previous one missed, and the combination of three distinct failure modes for the insect is what produces the outcome visible in the old farmhouse. Not sterility, not a building emptied of all biological life, but a consistent, season-after-season suppression of the populations that would otherwise establish themselves inside the structure. The first ingredient deserves its own full account, because the story of what it is, where it comes from, and why it works the way it does is one of the more genuinely surprising stories in the practical history of pest management. It begins not in a laboratory, but in a geological deposit, and it begins not in recent decades, but in a period of time that makes the history of human agriculture look like an afternoon. Somewhere in the high desert of Nevada, in a landscape that looks as though water has not visited it in a very long time, there are open-pit mining operations extracting a material that most visitors to a hardware store would walk past without a second glance. The bags are white, the print is small, and the product inside looks, to any casual inspection, like a particularly fine and unremarkable powder. What the powder actually is, examined under a scanning electron microscope, is one of the more extraordinary things a person can hold in their hand. Diatomaceous earth is composed of the fossilized skeletal remains of diatoms, which are single-celled aquatic organisms that lived in lakes, rivers, and oceans across hundreds of millions of years of geological time. Each individual diatom built itself a shell, called a frustule, out of silica, which is the same material that constitutes glass and quartz. When the diatom died, its soft biological tissue decomposed and disappeared, but the silica shell remained, settling to the bottom of whatever body of water the organism had inhabited, accumulating in layers over millennia until the water receded, the land shifted, and the deposits were left in geological formations that mining operations now extract. The University of Minnesota Extension describes the material plainly. Diatomaceous earth is made of fossilized diatoms, tiny organisms found in water, mined from underground deposits, and it works on contact without needing to be eaten by the target insect. That last point is not a minor technical detail. It is the property that separates diatomaceous earth from every category of pesticide that a consumer in 1955 or 1995 or today would find on a hardware shelf, because virtually every other pest control product in that category requires ingestion, inhalation, or absorption through biological pathways to function. The deposits being mined in Nevada and in similar geological formations across the American West were laid down during periods when those landscapes were covered by shallow inland seas and lake systems. The diatom species that built those deposits were alive during periods of Earth's history that precede the appearance of most large animal life. The shells they left behind have been compressed, preserved, and in some cases partially mineralized over spans of time that are genuinely difficult to hold in the mind alongside the ordinary scale of human experience. The powder in the white bag at the hardware store is, in a very literal sense, an ancient seabed ground fine. What makes the origin story practically significant rather than merely interesting is the relationship between the age of the material and its effectiveness. A synthetic chemical insecticide is a molecule, and a molecule can be altered by exposure to sunlight, water, bacterial activity, and the metabolic processes of the organisms it targets. Its effectiveness is therefore a function of its chemical stability over time and in conditions of use, which is why synthetic pesticides have shelf lives, degrade in certain environments, and require reformulation as target species develop resistance to the original compound. Diatomaceous earth has none of these vulnerabilities because it is not a molecule. It is a structure, a physical object at a scale so small that it interacts with insects at the level of their outer surface, and physical structures do not degrade the way chemical bonds do. The silica frustules that make up diatomaceous earth have a hardness rating on the Mohs scale, which is the standard measurement of a mineral's resistance to scratching, of approximately 7 out of 10. The outer layer of a typical household insect's exoskeleton, the waxy cuticle that holds its body fluids in place, is substantially softer than that. When an insect moves through a layer of diatomaceous earth, it is moving through a field of microscopic glass structures, each one shaped by the biology of the organism that built it into a form with edges and projections that abrade the cuticle on contact. The insect cannot feel this in the way a mammal would feel a cut, but the consequence accumulates with every step. A 2024 study published in Pest Management Science used open-flow respirometry, a technique that measures an organism's water loss through its breathing and outer surface simultaneously, alongside scanning electron microscopy imaging to document exactly what happens to an insect moving through diatomaceous earth at a structural level. The study confirmed that the material enhances dehydration by increasing both cuticular and respiratory water loss, with the particles acting as an absorbent that draws moisture away from the insect's surface, while the physical abrasion opens additional pathways for that moisture to escape. The insect does not die from a toxin interfering with its nervous system or its cellular processes. It dies from losing the water its body requires to function, at a rate it cannot compensate for. This mechanism has a consequence that the synthetic pesticide industry, despite decades of research and billions of dollars in development, has never been able to engineer into a chemical product. It is entirely immune to the development of resistance in target populations. The United States Environmental Protection Agency registers diatomaceous earth specifically as a mechanical insecticide rather than a chemical one, and that classification is not bureaucratic hairsplitting. It reflects a genuine, categorical difference in how the product acts. An insect population exposed to a chemical insecticide can, over successive generations, develop metabolic pathways that neutralize the chemical before it causes lethal harm. No population of insects across any number of generations can develop an exoskeleton that is harder than silica, because the biological materials available for constructing an insect exoskeleton do not include anything approaching the hardness of glass. The dust that the Nevada mining operation extracts today will work the same way it works now in 100 years and 500 years in any future in which insects still have exoskeletons made of the biological materials they are made of today. A synthetic pesticide formulated in 1960 and still sitting in a warehouse in 1980 would be losing its efficacy to chemical degradation. The diatomaceous earth applied to a farmhouse threshold in 1930, if it had stayed dry and in place, would be working at the same efficiency the day it was applied. That temporal stability is not a marketing claim. It is a direct consequence of the physical rather than chemical nature of the mechanism, and it is the property that makes the material genuinely remarkable in a category crowded with products that promise permanence and deliver obsolescence. Before that mechanism can be fully trusted, however, one distinction in the product category must be understood clearly, because not all diatomaceous earth sold commercially is the same material, and the difference between the two main forms is not a matter of brand preference but of genuine respiratory safety for the person applying it. Walk into the pool supply section of a large hardware store in any American city, and you will find bags of diatomaceous earth on the shelf alongside the chlorine tablets and the filter equipment. Walk to the garden and pest control section of the same store, and you will find more bags of diatomaceous earth, often at a similar price, in similar packaging with similar labeling. The products look nearly identical to a person who has not been told what to look for, and that visual similarity has sent a meaningful number of well-intentioned people home with the wrong product for a use that the wrong product can genuinely harm them with. The distinction between food-grade and pool-grade diatomaceous earth is not a marketing category invented to segment the consumer market. It reflects a real and significant difference in the physical structure of the material produced by two different manufacturing processes. Natural, unprocessed diatomaceous earth, the kind designated food-grade and registered with the Environmental Protection Agency for use as a pest control agent in homes, food storage areas, and around animals, retains the original amorphous silica structure of the fossilized diatom frustules. Amorphous silica is a form of the mineral in which the atoms are arranged without a regular repeating crystal pattern, and this structural quality is what makes it safe for incidental inhalation in the quantities encountered during normal application. Pool-grade diatomaceous earth is produced by heating the raw material to very high temperatures in a process called calcination. That heating causes the amorphous silica to reorganize at the molecular level into a crystalline form called cristobalite. Cristobalite is classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as a Group 1 carcinogen when inhaled as fine particles, meaning it is in the category of substances for which there is sufficient evidence of cancer-causing potential in humans rather than merely in laboratory animals. The particles of crystalline silica that become airborne during application are small enough to penetrate deep into lung tissue, and unlike amorphous silica, the crystalline form does not clear from lung tissue efficiently once it has lodged there. The reason pool-grade diatomaceous earth exists and is useful in its intended application is that the calcination process increases the material's filtration efficiency for swimming pool water, which is the only thing it was ever designed to do. It is not a pest control product. It was not developed or tested as a pest control product, and the fact that it resembles food-grade diatomaceous earth closely enough to be confused with it in a hardware aisle is a retail coincidence, rather than evidence that the two products are interchangeable. Using pool-grade diatomaceous earth as a household pest control agent means applying a known carcinogenic dust in living spaces, which is a result that inverts the entire purpose of replacing synthetic chemical pesticides with a safer alternative. Identifying food-grade diatomaceous earth in a retail setting requires reading the label rather than relying on visual inspection. The relevant designation to look for is a registration number from the Environmental Protection Agency on the label, which indicates the product has been reviewed and approved for its stated use. Products sold specifically for pest control in homes, gardens, and food storage areas and labeled food grade will carry this registration. Products sold for pool filtration will not carry a pest control registration, and their labels will specify filtration as the intended use. Some products marketed online or in bulk agricultural supply contexts carry descriptions that make the category ambiguous. And in those cases, the safest approach is to contact the manufacturer directly and ask whether the silica content is amorphous or crystalline before purchasing. Application safety applies even with food-grade material, because any fine dust inhaled in sufficient quantity creates a burden on the respiratory system regardless of its chemical composition. The practical guidance consistently offered in extension literature is to wear a dust mask rated for fine particle filtration during application, to apply the material when the area is unoccupied and allow any airborne particles to settle before people or pets return to the space, and to avoid applying it in quantities beyond what is needed for a thin, visible layer at the treatment site. A thick pile of diatomaceous earth is not more effective than a thin layer, because the insect only needs to walk through it rather than be buried in it, and an excessive application creates unnecessary dust exposure for the household without improving the pest control outcome. The reassurance that food-grade diatomaceous earth carries for the families in old farmhouses who have used it for generations is genuine and earned. It is listed by the Environmental Protection Agency as generally recognized as safe for use around food and food handling areas. It leaves no chemical residue that persists in the environment after the physical particles are removed. It does not contaminate groundwater, does not accumulate in animal tissue, and does not create the kind of ecological downstream effects that brought the synthetic pesticide era to the crisis that ended it. The distinction between food grade and pool grade is the only safety boundary that matters for household use. And once that boundary is understood and respected, The material is among the most benign pest control agents a household can deploy. One reapplication note that rests on a real property of the material rather than on habit or superstition. Diatomaceous earth must be dry to work. The mechanism of abrasion and moisture absorption that makes it lethal to insects at the threshold depends on the particles remaining loose and particulate rather than clumping into a paste. Water, whether from rain, condensation, or a wet mop passing over a treated threshold, temporarily disables the material by clumping the particles together and eliminating the sharp edges and absorbent surface area that the mechanism requires. The practical consequence is that outdoor applications near entry points should be reapplied after rain events, and indoor applications in areas prone to condensation should be checked periodically for moisture exposure. Once the material dries, it returns to full effectiveness. But the disrupted application should be replaced with a fresh, thin layer rather than relied upon in its clumped state. What food-grade diatomaceous earth cannot do, and what the old farmhouse system always recognized it could not do, is reach the colony from which foraging insects originate. It destroys the individual insect that crosses it. It does not send a signal back to the thousands of individuals that did not cross it and will not cross it until tonight, or next week, or next spring. That limitation is not a flaw in the material. It is the reason the second ingredient in the three-part system exists, and the second ingredient has been registered for use in American homes since 1948 for reasons that become immediately clear once its mechanism is understood. In 1948, the year that the United States government first registered boric acid as a pesticide for use in American homes, the country was 3 years out of the Second World War and in the middle of an era that treated chemistry as the answer to nearly every domestic problem. Synthetic pesticides were arriving on hardware shelves with the momentum of a genuine cultural enthusiasm for modern science, and the companies selling them had advertising budgets, distribution networks, and a post-war consumer class eager to believe that the laboratory had solved what previous generations had managed only imperfectly. Against that backdrop, boric acid registered quietly, without fanfare, and went on doing what it had always done while the louder products cycled through their period of dominance and then their period of consequence. Boric acid is a naturally occurring compound derived from boron, a mineral element found in deposits across the American West, with particularly significant concentrations in the desert regions of California, around a place called Death Valley and the Mojave. The compound itself is a white crystalline powder with a texture similar to fine table salt, and it dissolves readily in water, which is a property relevant to some of its applications, but not to the dry powder method used at entry points. It has been used by human beings in various forms for well over a century, appearing in medical literature as an antiseptic, in industrial processes as a flux for metalworking, and in household pest control in a form that has remained essentially unchanged since its first registration. The National Pesticide Information Center, which maintains one of the most comprehensive and carefully sourced databases of pesticide information available to the American public, states plainly that products containing boric acid have been registered for use in the United States since 1948, and that there are currently more than 500 such products sold across the country. That number is worth holding alongside the marketing landscape of any given year, because it suggests that boric acid has survived not one, but several complete cycles of pesticide fashion, from the DDT era through the organophosphate era through the pyrethroid era, without being replaced or rendered obsolete by any of them. Products that do not work do not accumulate 500 registered formulations across 7 decades. The reason boric acid has persisted across those cycles is that its mechanism operates at a level of biological fundamentality that synthetic chemistry has found difficult to circumvent or improve upon for the specific class of problems it addresses. Understanding that mechanism requires setting aside the mental model of a contact killer, the spray and watch them die product that the hardware store pest control aisle has trained most consumers to expect, and replacing it with a different picture entirely. Boric acid is not trying to kill the insect it touches. It is trying to reach the insect it cannot touch, the one that never leaves the nest, the one that processes food for the colony's larvae, the one whose continued survival determines whether the colony as a whole survives. The history of that mechanism's recognition in scientific literature is longer than most people assume. Entomologists working in the 1930s and 40s documented boric acid's effects on cockroach populations in urban settings and noted the distinctive pattern of its action: slow, spreading, and capable of affecting populations far beyond the individuals that made direct contact with the treated material. Those observations were not immediately translated into the dominant pest control paradigm of the post-war period, because the dominant paradigm was built around the dramatic, immediate, visible kill that DDT and its contemporaries provided and that made for compelling advertising. A product whose most important effects happen out of sight inside a wall over the course of several days does not photograph well for a 1950 magazine advertisement. What that lack of photogenic drama concealed was a capability that contact killers structurally cannot possess: the ability to reduce or eliminate a pest colony rather than merely its visible representatives. A colony of German cockroaches in the wall of a Chicago apartment building in 1955 might have sent dozens of foraging individuals out each night into the kitchen. A contact spray killed those foragers visibly and satisfyingly. The colony, undisturbed in the wall, produced more foragers the following night and the night after that, and the homeowner who had experienced the satisfying, visible kill found themselves buying another can of spray the following week. The economic structure of that cycle was, from the perspective of the manufacturer, very nearly perfect. Boric acid interrupts that cycle at the structural level rather than at the surface level, and the interruption is durable in a way that a contact kill is not. Its registration in 1948 was not an accident of regulatory timing, but a reflection of evidence that had been accumulating in entomological literature for more than a decade before the government formalized it. The compound that received that quiet registration in the same year that American households were being introduced to the most aggressive synthetic pesticide marketing campaign in history went on to outlast every product that overshadowed it during that campaign, and it remains today one of the most widely used and carefully documented pest control agents available to the American household without a license or a service contract. The mechanism by which boric acid accomplishes what contact killers cannot is specific enough to explain in detail, and detailed enough that understanding it changes the way a person thinks about what pest control is actually trying to achieve. That explanation begins not with the compound itself, but with a foraging cockroach on a kitchen floor in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, moving through a thin layer of white powder it has no reason to avoid, and carrying with it, without knowing it, the means of its colony's eventual collapse. A German cockroach moving across a kitchen floor at 2 a.m. is not making decisions in any way that resembles human deliberation, but it is doing something that is, from a pest control perspective, extraordinarily consequential. It is evaluating its environment through chemoreceptors, the biological equivalents of taste and smell distributed across its legs, antennae, and mouth parts, and it is deciding, moment by moment, whether to continue in a given direction or redirect. Repellent substances register on those chemoreceptors as a signal to redirect. Boric acid, at the concentrations used in household pest control, does not register on those chemoreceptors as anything at all. The National Pesticide Information Center's documentation on boric acid states this property with a directness that makes its significance immediately clear. Boric acid is generally known to be non-repellent at lower concentrations, and being non-repellent is a major advantage because pests will not avoid the treated area and are therefore exposed to the toxicant. That sentence contains an idea that runs against the intuitive assumption most people bring to pest control, which is that a good pesticide should announce itself, should be something the insect encounters and reacts to visibly. The most powerful thing about boric acid in this context is precisely that the insect does not react to it, because an insect that does not react to a substance walks through it, grooms itself, and feeds other members of its colony with it. The physical action on a cockroach moving through a boric acid application works through 2 simultaneous pathways. As the insect crosses the treated surface, the fine powder clings to the hairs and joints of its legs, a consequence of both the particle size of the material and the physical structure of the cockroach's appendages. which are covered in sensory hairs that trap particulate matter with considerable efficiency. The cockroach then does what cockroaches do with near constant regularity. It grooms itself, drawing its legs through its mouthparts to clean them, and in doing so, ingests the powder that has accumulated on its leg surfaces. Once ingested, boric acid acts as a stomach poison, interfering with the insect's metabolic processes at the cellular level over a period that ranges from several hours to several days, depending on the quantity ingested and the size of the individual. The delay in that timeline is the mechanism's most important feature, and it is the feature that most distinguishes boric acid from the contact killers that dominated the post-war hardware shelf. A contact killer that drops a foraging cockroach within minutes of exposure does exactly one thing. It removes that individual from the kitchen floor. The colony behind the baseboard continues its activity without interruption, because no signal of danger has returned to it, no dead forager has communicated anything useful about the kitchen environment, and the forager's absence is simply registered as a vacancy to be filled by another individual from the same pool. The forager that walks through boric acid and survives long enough to return to the colony carries the material on its body and in its digestive system. What happens next is a function of cockroach social biology, specifically the behavior called trophallaxis, in which individuals exchange food and digestive fluids mouth to mouth. This exchange is not occasional or incidental. It is a primary mechanism by which cockroach colonies distribute nutrition, particularly to nymphs and to the reproductive individuals at the colony's center who do not forage. A forager returning from a boric acid application and engaging in trophallaxis with colony members that have never left the nest is, in effect, delivering the substance to individuals that no surface application could ever reach directly. The colony-level effect documented in entomological literature follows from this biology in a way that is genuinely difficult to replicate by any other means available to a household without professional equipment. Worker ants, which exhibit similar food-sharing behaviors to cockroaches through a process called stomodial trophallaxis, carry boric acid bait back to the nest and share it with other workers, larvae, and the queen through that food exchange. The delayed action of the substance is what allows the toxin to spread through the colony before individuals begin to die, meaning that the distribution of the material through the social network of the colony is essentially complete before the colony has any reason to alter its behavior in response to it. Concentration matters enormously in this mechanism, and the extension literature is specific about why. Higher concentrations of boric acid produce faster individual kills but limit the colony-wide impact, because a forager that dies before returning to the nest delivers nothing to the colony, and a forager that shows visible symptoms of distress may trigger avoidance behavior in other colony members before the material has spread. The concentrations used in household applications, typically between 1 and 2% in bait formulations and somewhat higher in dry powder perimeter applications, are calibrated to allow sufficient survival time for the forager to return and interact with colony members while still delivering a lethal dose through repeated exposure and grooming. This calibration is not folk wisdom. It is the result of laboratory studies published in entomological journals across several decades of research. The abrasive property of boric acid adds a secondary action that operates independently of ingestion. The fine crystalline particles abrade the waxy cuticle of the insect's outer layer in a manner that has some functional similarity to the action of diatomaceous earth, though the two materials are chemically distinct and their abrasive properties differ in scale and mechanism. This secondary action accelerates the dehydration effect on individuals that walk through a dry powder application, adding a contact component to what is primarily a stomach poison mechanism and creating a dual pathway to the same outcome that makes the material more effective across a wider range of exposure scenarios than either mechanism would achieve alone. What boric acid genuinely cannot do is reach egg cases, and this limitation is not a minor footnote but a structural boundary on the method's effectiveness that the old farmhouse approach acknowledged implicitly by treating the entry point rather than the interior. A single egg case of the German cockroach, a species that has been documented in American urban housing since at least the early 19th century, can contain up to 40 nymphs. The egg case is sealed, physically isolated from the environment outside it, and the embryos developing inside it are not engaged in any of the feeding or grooming behaviors that make boric acid effective against mobile individuals. An infestation that is already deeply established inside the walls of a structure, with egg cases distributed through the spaces behind cabinetry and inside wall voids, represents a problem at a scale and in a location that a surface-level application at the entry point cannot address. This honest boundary around boric acid's effectiveness is precisely the reason the old farmhouse system treats the threshold rather than the interior, and it is the reason the method works best as prevention rather than remediation. A colony that never establishes itself inside the structure because its foragers consistently encounter a treated threshold and carry the material back before the colony grows large enough to distribute egg cases through the wall, voids, is a colony that boric acid can address with the full force of its mechanism. A colony that has already distributed egg cases through 3 feet of wall space in a structure that has been occupied for a decade is a different problem, one that requires a different intervention. And presenting the old farmhouse method as a solution to that problem would be dishonest, in a way that would ultimately cost the method its credibility with the people it can most genuinely help. The third ingredient in the system does not work the way either of the first two work, and its role is different enough that understanding it requires setting aside the frameworks that apply to physical abrasion and slow-acting stomach poisons entirely. It does not kill in the conventional sense. It speaks in a language that insects have been reading for far longer than human beings have been keeping farmhouses. And what it says to an insect approaching a treated threshold is a message that requires no translation and admits no argument. In the kitchen of a farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania sometime in the 1920s, a woman named Margaret would have reached into a cloth bag hanging near the pantry door and pulled out a handful of dried bay leaves without giving the action much conscious thought. The leaves went onto the pantry shelves, along the window sills, and into the corners of the flour and grain storage without ceremony, because the action was not a remedy being applied to a problem, but a maintenance habit being performed in the same register as sweeping the floor or checking the door latch. The insects that did not appear in that pantry were not noticed because their absence was the expected condition rather than a result requiring explanation. Bay laurel, known in botanical literature as Laurus nobilis, produces in its leaves a complex mixture of volatile organic compounds that are released continuously as the leaf material dries and as temperature fluctuations cause the oils within the leaf structure to volatilize into the surrounding air. The compound profile includes eucalyptol, also called cineole, along with linalool, terpineol, and several related terpene compounds, and it is this volatile mixture that gives dried bay leaves their characteristic sharp, resinous scent. That scent is not incidental to the leaf's pest control function. It is the mechanism working through the olfactory systems of insects in a way that documented research has confirmed is aversive to a range of species relevant to household pest management. Published research in journals including the Journal of Stored Products Research has examined the repellent activity of bay leaf essential oils against stored product pests, a category that includes weevils, grain beetles, and flower moths, which are exactly the insects that a 19th-century farmhouse pantry was most concerned about protecting against. The studies consistently find that the volatile compounds from bay leaf material, and particularly the eucalyptal fraction, produce statistically significant repellent effects at concentrations achievable by simply placing dried leaves in an enclosed storage space. The mechanism is olfactory interference. The insect's chemoreceptors, which it uses to locate food sources, are overwhelmed or confused by the volatile signal from the bay leaf compounds to a degree that disrupts orientation toward the food source the insect is seeking. The important boundary to draw here, and the old farmhouse system drew it implicitly through the way the ingredients were deployed, is that bay leaf is a repellent rather than a lethal agent. It does not kill the insects that encounter its volatile field. It redirects them. An insect with a sufficiently strong motivation to reach a food source, a cockroach that has already established a foraging route through a heavily infested structure, will not be turned away by the presence of dried bay leaves the way a naive individual approaching from outside might be. Presenting bay leaf as a universal insect killer would be inaccurate, and that inaccuracy would surface quickly in the experience of anyone who placed bay leaves in an already infested kitchen and expected an immediate resolution. What bay leaf does with genuine and documented effectiveness is influence the approach behavior of insects that have not yet committed to an entry route. An insect detecting the volatile compounds of bay laurel from outside a structure or at the boundary of a treated threshold is receiving a signal through the same chemosensory pathways it uses to evaluate whether a space is safe and navigable. The signal from bay leaf essential oils is not the same as a toxin signal, which would produce avoidance through a different and more urgent neurological response. It is closer to an environmental quality signal, something in the chemical landscape of the space that makes it less attractive as a destination than an untreated alternative. Given a choice between an entry point that smells of bay laurel and one that does not, laboratory studies show a consistent preference for the untreated option across multiple species. Eugenol, which is the primary active compound in clove oil and is present in smaller concentrations in some bay leaf varieties, adds a dimension to the repellent profile that goes beyond simple olfactory deterrence. The Environmental Protection Agency has reviewed eugenol as a minimum risk pesticide active ingredient, a designation reserved for compounds with a history of safe use and a documented mode of action against pest species. Eugenol acts on the octopamine receptor system of insects, which is a neurological pathway that has no direct equivalent in the human nervous system, meaning that compounds acting on it can be highly effective against insects without posing the same neurological risks to mammals. The result is a compound that genuinely qualifies as insecticidal rather than merely repellent, and its presence in clove oil makes that material a useful addition to the volatile layer at a treated entry point. The practical application of bay leaf in the three-part system reflects its nature as a perimeter influence. Dried leaves placed at the outermost edge of the entry zone, along the exterior sill, under a doormat, or in the gap between a door frame and the exterior wall, create a volatile field that an approaching insect encounters before it reaches the diatomaceous earth layer. The sequence matters because the repellent layer is most effective against insects that have not yet committed to crossing the threshold, and its influence diminishes sharply once an insect has already entered the structure and is foraging rather than approaching. Inside the structure, where the insect is already past the perimeter, bay leaf offers much less than it does at the boundary. The combination of eucalyptol's olfactory disruption, eugenol's receptor-level insecticidal action in clove preparations, and the simple mechanical fact of a volatile barrier that makes a treated entry point smell like a less attractive destination creates a first layer that addresses the population that neither diatomaceous earth nor boric acid can reach efficiently, the insect that never crosses the threshold at all. Diatomaceous earth destroys the individual that crosses. Boric acid reaches the colony through the forager that crosses and returns. Bay leaf and clove reduce the number of insects that attempt the crossing in the first place. Together, the three layers address three distinct populations simultaneously, and the logic of that layering is the reason the system produces outcomes that no single ingredient could produce on its own. What remains before the recipe and application can be discussed with full practicality is the larger story of how this system, documented in extension literature, grounded in mechanisms that peer-reviewed research has confirmed, and available for a total annual cost that would not trouble a household budget in any significant way, came to feel like something from a different era, something that needed to be rediscovered rather than simply continued. That story begins not in a laboratory but in an advertising campaign, with a phrase that was printed on the side of a product container in 1947, and that, in retrospect, contains one of the most consequential lies ever told to the American household. Lay the three ingredients side by side on a workbench and consider what each one is actually doing at the moment of its action. The dried bay leaf is releasing volatile compounds into the air column directly outside the entry point, creating a chemical environment that an approaching insect reads as hostile to navigation before it has touched any surface in the treated zone. The diatomaceous earth is sitting in a thin layer across the threshold itself, a field of microscopic silica structures waiting in complete passivity for physical contact with an insect's outer layer. The boric acid is distributed along the interior edge of the entry zone, and in the wall, gaps adjacent to the frame, non-repellent and invisible to any insect that encounters it, positioned to travel back to a location it was never directly applied to. 3 different mechanisms, 3 different target populations, 3 different timescales of action. Nothing about this is redundant. The logic of layering in pest management is not a folk invention. It mirrors a principle that professional integrated pest management programs, the framework endorsed by the Environmental Protection Agency and by extension services at land-grant universities across the country, call multiple modes of action. The reasoning behind that principle is straightforward enough that it does not require a technical background to grasp. Any single control method will have a failure mode, a population it cannot reach, a condition under which it does not perform, a biological boundary it cannot cross. Combining methods with different failure modes means that the population which escapes the first method encounters the second, and the population that escapes the second encounters the third. The total suppression achieved by the combination is not additive but multiplicative, because each successive layer acts on the survivors of the previous one. Consider what happens when the system is absent and a household relies on a single contact spray applied to the kitchen floor on a quarterly schedule. The spray eliminates foragers present at the time of application. The colony behind the baseboard, undisturbed, sends new foragers within hours. The egg cases distributed through the wall voids continue developing on a timeline unaffected by any surface event. Within days, the kitchen looks exactly as it did before the application, and the household's experience of the quarterly contract is that it manages rather than resolves, which is precisely what the economic structure of the contract is designed to produce. Now run the same scenario with the 3-layer system active at every entry point. The insect population outside the structure encounters a volatile deterrent at the boundary, and a meaningful fraction redirects to a different approach or abandons the attempt. The individuals that continue past the deterrent reach a physical layer that inflicts lethal damage on their outer surface and accelerates dehydration to a fatal degree before they have penetrated the interior. The individuals that survive the physical layer, which in a well-maintained application should be very few, encounter the boric acid zone, carry it on their bodies and in their digestive tracts back to the colony, and distribute it through trophylactic exchange to individuals that have never left the nest. Each stage of the sequence catches a different subset of the approaching population, and the colony that sent them receives, in return, not the information that a food source is available, but a slow-acting substance working against its core population. The timeline differences between the 3 mechanisms are worth making explicit because they explain why the system's effects accumulate over weeks, rather than appearing dramatically on the day of application. Bay leaf acts immediately on any insect within its volatile range, which is a matter of centimeters to a few feet depending on temperature and air movement. Diatomaceous earth acts within hours of contact, as the abrasion and moisture loss it produces cross the threshold at which the insect can no longer maintain hydration. Boric acid acts over a period of days to weeks, as foragers return to the colony, distribute the material through social feeding, and the cumulative dosage across colony members reaches levels that disrupt reproduction and normal function at the colony's center. A household that applies the system on a Saturday and evaluates it the following Monday is evaluating the bay leaf layer and the beginning of the diatomaceous earth effect. The boric acid layer's contribution becomes visible in the form of reduced forager numbers and eventually colony collapse over the following weeks. This temporal spread is not a weakness in the system. It is the mechanism by which it achieves what contact killers cannot achieve, a reduction in the source population rather than merely the visible population. The frustration that a contact spray user feels when new foragers appear the day after application is the frustration of a method that has no temporal depth, that acts only at the surface and only at the moment of contact. The 3-layer system's apparent slowness in the first week is the time during which its most important action, the colony-level strike through boric acid distribution, is proceeding invisibly inside the wall. The patience the system requires is the patience of a method that is working on the right problem rather than the visible one. The University of Minnesota Extension and the Colorado State Extension Service both document the individual mechanisms of these materials in language accessible to any adult reader, and neither source presents the use of these materials at entry points as exotic or experimental. The documentation treats them as practical options within an integrated management approach, noting their low toxicity profiles, their long registration histories, and their applicability to residential settings without professional assistance. What neither source does, for reasons that have more to do with the structure of extension communication than with the effectiveness of the approach, is present the three-material combination as a unified system with the explicit logic laid out in the sequence described here. That synthesis is what the old farmhouse practice preserved, and what the post-war era of synthetic pesticide marketing interrupted. The question of how three inexpensive, non-patentable materials with documented mechanisms and long safety records came to feel like forgotten knowledge rather than current standard practice is the question that the DDT story answers. But before that story begins, the practical details of the system deserve their own space, because the recipe and application method are the point at which the logic of the system translates into something a person can do on a Saturday afternoon with materials purchased at a single hardware store for an amount that would not require a second look at a household budget. Those practical details carry their own precision, and the precision matters for the same reason that the mechanisms matter. Because a system applied incorrectly does not produce the outcomes the mechanisms predict, and the person who applies it incorrectly and reports that it does not work has not tested the system. They have tested a misapplication of it. A Saturday afternoon and a single trip to a hardware store are genuinely all the preparation this system requires, and the specificity of what to buy matters enough to state plainly before the application method is described. Food-grade diatomaceous earth in a quantity of roughly 2 pounds is sufficient for a full treatment of a standard residential property with 6 to 8 entry points. Boric acid powder, sold under various brand names but chemically identical across them, in a quantity of 1 pound, covers the same property comfortably with material left over for reapplication. Dried bay leaves, available in the spice aisle of any grocery store in quantities of 1 to 2 ounces, are more than sufficient for a single treatment cycle. Clove oil, if included for the eugenol contribution to the volatile layer, requires only a small bottle of the kind sold in pharmacies and natural food stores. The total expenditure for these 4 materials at current retail prices runs between $15 and $30 depending on the retailer and the region, a figure that represents somewhere between 1/20th and 1/30th of what the average American household spends annually on a recurring pest control service contract. The application sequence follows the same logic as the layering system itself, working from the outermost perimeter inward so that each layer is placed in its correct position relative to the insect's direction of approach. Begin outside, at the exterior face of every entry point the structure has: the front door, the back door, any side entries, cellar access points, and the gaps around utility penetrations where pipes or cables enter the building from outside. At each of these locations, the first action is to place 3 to 5 dried bay leaves directly against the exterior face of the frame, tucked into the gap between the frame and the exterior siding if one exists, or laid flat on the exterior sill if the frame sits flush against the wall. If clove oil is part of the application, 2 to 3 drops applied directly to the bay leaves or to a small cotton pad placed alongside them adds the eugenol layer to the volatile field without requiring a separate application step. The second step, still at the exterior, is to apply a thin line of food-grade diatomaceous earth along the base of the exterior door frame, across the threshold if the door opens outward and the threshold is exposed to exterior approach, and along the exterior windowsills of any ground floor windows. Thin is the operative word here, because the mechanism requires only that an insect's legs make contact with the particles, not that the insect be buried in them. A line roughly 1/4 of an inch wide and thin enough that the surface beneath it is still faintly visible is both sufficient for the mechanism and less likely to be disturbed by foot traffic than a thicker application. In areas where the application will be exposed to rain or irrigation spray, the reapplication schedule should be set at every significant rainfall event, because the moisture sensitivity of the mechanism means that a wet application is a temporarily disabled one. The third step moves to the interior threshold, the strip of surface immediately inside the door that an insect crosses after penetrating the exterior layer. Here, the boric acid application belongs, because this is the location where a surviving forager will make contact with the material and carry it back on its body. Boric acid powder applied in a line along the interior base of the door frame, in the gap between the door frame and the flooring, and in any visible cracks or gaps in the baseboard adjacent to the entry point, covers the interior perimeter where forager traffic is most concentrated. The same thin-line discipline applies. The material does not need to be visible as a significant deposit to be effective, and a heavy application creates unnecessary dust exposure without improving the outcome. In the gap between the bottom of the door frame and the flooring, where foot traffic will not disturb it, the application can be slightly more generous because this location represents the most direct path from exterior to interior, and the highest probability contact point for any insect that has passed the exterior layers. Interior pantry and food storage areas benefit from a separate bay leaf application, independent of the entry point treatment. Dried bay leaves placed on each shelf of a pantry, in the corners of flour and grain containers, and along the interior edges of cabinet shelves where stored products sit, create a volatile field within the enclosed space that addresses the stored product pest population, weevils, grain beetles, and flour moths, that approaches food sources from within the structure, rather than from outside. This interior application does not substitute for the entry point treatment, but complements it by addressing the different approach route that stored product pests typically use. The question of duration is one where honesty matters more than optimism. Bay leaves retain meaningful volatile activity for approximately 3 to 6 months under typical indoor conditions, after which the essential oil content of the dried material has diminished to the point where replacement is advisable. The replacement cost of a fresh packet of dried bay leaves from a grocery store is between $1 and $3, making the reapplication economics entirely trivial. Diatomaceous earth, when kept dry, retains its physical structure indefinitely and does not degrade in the way a chemical formulation does, but outdoor applications will require reapplication after rain events, and indoor applications in areas with seasonal humidity changes should be refreshed at the beginning of each season. Boric acid in dry powder form is similarly stable when kept dry, and an application in a protected interior gap can remain effective for months to a year before replacement is needed. The full seasonal maintenance cycle for the 3-layer system at a standard residential property takes approximately 45 minutes to complete once the initial application has been made and the household is familiar with the locations and quantities involved. The initial application, which requires identifying every entry point and applying each material in sequence, takes between 90 minutes and 2 hours for a property with 6 to 8 entry points. Neither figure represents a significant time investment relative to the outcomes the system is designed to achieve, and both figures are substantially less than the time most households spend dealing with the consequences of a pest control approach that addresses visible populations rather than source populations. One practical note that the extension literature makes clearly and that deserves explicit statement here: the system works best as prevention rather than remediation. A household that applies the 3-layer treatment before any significant pest presence has established itself inside the structure will find the system highly effective at maintaining that condition. A household attempting to use the same treatment to resolve an active, established infestation inside the walls is asking the system to do something it was not designed to do. And the honest answer in that situation is that the entry point treatment should be applied to prevent reinfestation while a separate remediation strategy addresses the existing colony. This is not a limitation unique to the old farmhouse method. It is a limitation that applies to every pest control strategy that operates at the entry point, including the quarterly spray contract, which also fails to resolve established infestations in wall voids and returns the household to the same condition the following quarter. What the old farmhouse system and the quarterly spray contract share is a boundary at the wall surface. What they do not share is the economic structure behind them, the mechanisms they use, the environmental profile of the materials involved, or the historical trajectory of those materials across the decades since 1945. That trajectory is where the story takes its darkest turn, because the product that displaced the old methods from mainstream American practice did not do so because it worked better or lasted longer or proved safer. It did so because it had a marketing budget, a manufacturer with a post-war industrial infrastructure, and an advertising campaign that produced one of the most consequential slogans in the history of American consumer culture. In 1947, a full-page advertisement appeared in American magazines and newspapers carrying a slogan that, read today, produces a reaction somewhere between disbelief and genuine unease. The slogan was, "DDT is good for me," and it ran above an illustration of a tableau of American agricultural and domestic abundance. A cow, a potato plant, an apple, a chicken, ears of corn, and in the center of the composition, a smiling figure representing the American farmer and housewife, all of them celebrating the arrival of a chemical compound that the advertisement described as a benefactor of all humanity. The copy surrounding the illustration assured readers that DDT was not merely effective against insects, but was safe for every member of the family, including the children, the pets, and the food on the table. The company behind that advertisement was Geigy, the Swiss chemical manufacturer that had developed DDT as an insecticide during the Second World War, and had watched its military applications, used to control typhus-carrying lice among troops and malaria-carrying mosquitoes in occupied territories, generate a reputation as a genuinely miraculous compound. The transition from military application to civilian consumer product followed the end of the war with the speed and enthusiasm that characterized the entire post-war conversion of wartime chemistry to peacetime commerce. And the marketing apparatus that accompanied that transition was sophisticated enough to understand that a product previously associated with military logistics needed a domestic identity before American housewives would reach for it on a hardware shelf. The domestic identity constructed for DDT in the advertising of the late 1940s was one of the more precisely engineered pieces of consumer persuasion of its era. The product was positioned not as a chemical in the way that a bleach or a solvent was a chemical, something to be handled carefully and stored away from children, but as a modern convenience in the same category as a refrigerator or a washing machine, a product of science that the modern American home simply ought to have. Stock images and advertising illustrations from the period show American housewives applying DDT to kitchen surfaces with the casual confidence of someone wiping down a counter with a damp cloth. Other images from the same period, documented in newspaper archives and public health photography collections from cities including New York and Chicago, show children playing in the chemical fog produced by municipal spray trucks moving through residential neighborhoods on summer afternoons. The children running through the mist with the evident pleasure of running through a garden sprinkler. Those images were not produced by critics of DDT documenting something alarming. They were produced by the municipalities and the public health agencies conducting the spraying as documentation of a beneficial public health program, and they appeared in newspapers as evidence of a modern city taking care of its residents. The cultural context in which a photograph of children running through pesticide fog was a positive image rather than a disturbing one is not easy to reconstruct from a contemporary vantage point, but it was the genuine context of 1948 and 1952 and 1958, in city after city across the United States. What the advertising did to the old farmhouse methods was not a direct attack. It did not require anyone to write a bulletin discrediting diatomaceous earth or issue a government statement declaring bay leaves ineffective. The mechanism was simpler and more powerful than any direct assault could have been. It made the old methods feel embarrassing. A woman who reached for a bag of diatomaceous earth in 1952, the year that DDT was at the peak of its domestic market penetration, was doing something that the advertising landscape around her framed as a relic of a pre-scientific era, something her grandmother had done because her grandmother had not had access to the miracles of modern chemistry. The social pressure of that framing was not coercive in any legal sense, but it was effective in the way that all successful advertising is effective, by making the alternative to the advertised product feel not merely inferior, but vaguely shameful. The advertising also worked because DDT was, in the short term and against the initial target populations, genuinely effective. A housewife in Chicago who applied DDT to her kitchen surfaces in 1949 and watched the cockroach population decline over the following weeks had real evidence for the product's claims, and that real evidence made the advertising's broader assertions, including the safety claims, feel credible. The experience of effectiveness is a powerful endorser, and a product that works visibly in the short term earns a degree of trust that survives a considerable amount of contrary information before that trust is withdrawn. The contrary information, when it eventually arrived, had to overcome not just the advertising but the lived experience of a generation of American households that had watched DDT do exactly what the advertisement said it would do. What those households could not observe from their kitchen floors was the scale at which DDT was being used simultaneously across the entire country, because the kitchen application was only the most visible fraction of the total. American farmers were applying it to crops in quantities that dwarfed household use. Municipal governments were applying it to parks, roadsides, and wetlands. The federal government was conducting aerial applications over forests and agricultural regions in programs designed to eliminate pest species at landscape scale. Each application released DDT into the environment at a location where it did not stay, because DDT is a persistent organic pollutant that travels through food chains, accumulates in fatty tissue, concentrates as it moves up the trophic levels from insects to small animals to birds to mammals, and does not degrade in the environment at a rate that limits that accumulation. The housewife applying it to her kitchen surfaces was participating, without knowing it, in one of the largest chemical releases into the American environment in the country's history. The numbers that eventually emerged from the historical record of DDT use in the United States are striking in a way that the advertising never prepared anyone to expect. Americans applied more than 1,350,000,000 pounds of the compound on crops, lawns, pets, and in their homes before the alarm was raised loudly enough to produce regulatory action. That figure translates to approximately 7.5 pounds for every person living in the United States at the peak of the compound's use, which means that the per capita DDT burden of the American population during that period was not a trace exposure, but a substantial one, distributed through food, water, air, and direct skin contact across the full span of the compound's years of domestic use. The miracle that the advertising had promised was being delivered at a scale that the advertising had never mentioned, and that most consumers had no means of calculating from their position at the kitchen counter with a spray bottle in their hand. The reckoning that followed was not immediate, because the harms that DDT produced were not the kind that appear in a kitchen the morning after an application. They were the kind that appear in a bird population that has stopped reproducing successfully, in a fish population that has accumulated tissue concentrations of a compound that was never meant to be in water, in a generation of children whose in utero exposures would not produce their measurable health consequences for another 40 or 50 years. That delayed consequence is the most consequential thing about persistent organic pollutants as a category, and it is the reason the DDT story took as long as it did to reach its regulatory conclusion. Stand in a field outside of Des Moines, Iowa, in the summer of 1955 and look up. The aircraft moving low over the corn rows is not unusual. It is one of hundreds operating that week across the Midwest, each one releasing a measured discharge of DDT in a fine mist that settles onto the crop surface, the soil, the drainage ditches at the field edges, and the creek that runs along the property's eastern boundary toward a river that connects eventually to the Mississippi watershed. The pilot has a contract, the farmer has a bill of sale, and the county extension office has recommended the application as standard agricultural practice. Nobody in that field is doing anything that is not, in 1955, entirely normal. The normality of DDT use in mid-century America is the detail that the retrospective account most often flattens into a simple story of corporate deception, when the reality was considerably more distributed and considerably more mundane than deception implies. DDT was recommended by extension agents, prescribed by public health officials, applied by school districts to gymnasium floors before dances, used by the military on the clothing and bedding of returning veterans, and sold in hardware stores in formulations designed for home use with the same casual accessibility as paint thinner or wood stain. The infrastructure of its distribution was not hidden. It was the mainstream of American pest management for nearly 3 decades, and the people who participated in it were following the best available guidance of their moment. The aggregate of that mainstream participation produced a total that the historical and environmental literature has documented with increasing precision as the decades of research have accumulated. Americans applied more than 1,350,000,000 pounds of DDT to their land, their homes, their bodies, and their food supply across the span of its domestic use from the mid-1940s through 1972. Translated into a per capita figure for the American population of that era, this represents approximately 7.5 pounds of the compound for every man, woman, and child living in the United States during the period of peak use. 7.5 pounds is not a trace exposure. It is a quantity that, if it were a food ingredient, would register as a significant dietary component rather than an incidental contaminant. The distribution of that total across different application categories reveals something important about where the compound actually went relative to where it was most visible to consumers. Agricultural application accounted for the largest single fraction, with American farms receiving the majority of the total tonnage applied. Forestry applications, in which federal and state programs sprayed enormous tracts of woodland to control species including the spruce budworm and the gypsy moth, accounted for a substantial additional fraction. Municipal applications to parks, roadways, and wetlands for mosquito control added another layer. Household applications, which were the most visible to individual consumers because they happened in personal spaces and were actively marketed to homeowners, represented a smaller fraction of the total tonnage, but a larger fraction of the direct human exposure because they happened in enclosed residential spaces where ventilation was limited and contact with treated surfaces was continuous. The biochemical property that turned this distributed application into a systemic environmental crisis is DDT's lipophilicity, meaning its tendency to dissolve in fats rather than in water. A water-soluble compound released into the environment dilutes as it spreads through water systems and eventually reaches concentrations too low to cause biological effects at any single point in the food chain. DDT does not behave this way. When it enters the body of any organism, it is stored in fatty tissue rather than excreted, and it remains there, accumulating with each subsequent exposure until the organism's fat reserves are mobilized through starvation, pregnancy, or lactation, at which point the stored compound is released into the bloodstream and delivered to whatever tissue the fat is supplying at that moment, including, in the case of a lactating mother of any species, the nursing offspring. This property of bioaccumulation was not unknown in principle to the chemists who developed DDT and the regulatory agencies that approved it. What was not understood, or not understood at the scale that the actual application volumes eventually revealed, was the degree to which bioaccumulation compounded as it moved up trophic levels in ecosystems. A small insect in a treated field accumulates a concentration of DDT from its food and its environment. A small bird eating thousands of those insects accumulates a concentration many times higher than the insect held. A hawk eating dozens of those small birds accumulates a concentration many times higher still. At the top of the food chain, concentrations that were measured in parts per billion at the level of the original application had become parts per million in the fatty tissue of predatory birds, raptors, and fish-eating species, a phenomenon that field biologists working in the 1950s began to notice in the form of eggshell thinning and reproductive failure in populations of ospreys, bald eagles, and peregrine falcons across the eastern United States. Rachel Carson, a marine biologist and science writer based in the Washington area, spent 4 years assembling the available evidence on DDT's environmental effects, and published her findings in a book called Silent Spring in 1962. The title referred to a spring season in which the birds that had previously announced the season's arrival were absent from the landscape. Their populations collapsed by the reproductive failure that DDT's concentration in their food chain had produced. The book was not a work of speculation or advocacy in the sense of going beyond the evidence available. It was a synthesis of published research from ornithologists, wildlife biologists, and toxicologists, presented in language accessible to a general audience, and its argument rested on observations that field scientists had been making and publishing in specialist journals for nearly a decade before Carson assembled them into a single, coherent account. The chemical industry's response to Silent Spring was immediate, organized, and personally directed at Carson in terms that, read today, reflect the scale of the economic interest at stake, rather than the strength of the scientific counter-argument. Velsicol Chemical Corporation, one of the major producers of chlorinated pesticides, wrote to Carson's publisher before the book appeared threatening legal action if it was published. Industry-funded scientists produced reviews characterizing Carson's work as alarmist and her conclusions as unsupported. One particularly widely circulated industry response described Carson as a spinster with no children who could not therefore be expected to understand the importance of pest control for food production, an argument whose relationship to the scientific questions at issue was exactly zero, but whose intended effect on public opinion was clearly understood by the people who produced it. What the industry response could not do was alter the data that had produced Carson's argument, because the data had not originated with Carson and did not depend on her interpretation for its validity. The birds were not reproducing. The eggshells were measurably thinner. The DDT concentrations in the fatty tissue of predatory species were measurably higher than anything that could be explained by direct exposure to application levels. The scientific literature that accumulated in the years following Silent Spring's publication did not weaken Carson's case. It strengthened it, and it added a dimension that Carson had addressed only partially: the effects of DDT exposure not on wildlife populations but on human beings, and specifically on the human beings who had been most directly exposed during the years when the compound was being applied to kitchen surfaces, sprayed on children's clothing, and recommended by pediatricians as a safe lice treatment for school-aged children. On the 2nd of June, 1972, William Ruckelshaus, the first administrator of the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency, signed a cancellation order for DDT that ended its registered use in the United States for virtually all domestic applications. The signing took place after 2 years of administrative proceedings that had generated more than 9,000 pages of testimony from scientists, public health officials, industry representatives, and environmental advocates, making it one of the most extensively documented regulatory decisions in the agency's early history. Ruckelshaus had been appointed to lead the EPA only 2 years earlier. In 1970, the same year the agency was created, and the DDT cancellation was the first major test of whether the new regulatory body would act on the scientific record or yield to the economic and political pressure that the chemical industry had been applying since Silent Spring appeared a decade before. The decision was not, as the industry's subsequent characterization of it sometimes implied, a political response to public emotion overriding scientific consensus. The administrative record that supported the cancellation order documented specific and measurable harms across multiple categories of evidence: the population collapses of predatory bird species, the measurable thinning of eggshells in osprey and bald eagle populations along the Atlantic seaboard, the accumulation of DDT residues in human breast milk at concentrations that exceeded the tolerance levels the Food and Drug Administration had set for DDT in commercial food products, and the epidemiological data beginning to emerge from studies of human populations with documented high exposures. Each category of evidence had been contested by industry-funded researchers during the proceedings, and Ruckelshaus had weighed the contested claims against the independent scientific record before issuing the cancellation. The classification of DDT as a probable human carcinogen, which is the designation it holds today under the International Agency for Research on Cancer's Group 2A classification, did not arrive with the 1972 ban, but accumulated in the research literature over the decades following it. The carcinogenicity designation rests on a combination of animal study data, which showed consistent tumor formation across multiple species at various exposure levels, and epidemiological data from human populations, which showed elevated rates of specific cancer types in individuals with documented high DDT exposure or high concentrations of DDE, the primary metabolic breakdown product of DDT, in their blood serum. DDE is itself persistent in the body and in the environment, meaning that the biological legacy of DDT use did not end with the cancellation order, but continued to accumulate in the fatty tissue of the American population for years after the compound was no longer being applied. The environmental legacy outside human bodies followed a similarly extended timeline. DDT and its breakdown products were detected in Arctic wildlife populations that had never been within thousands of miles of an American cornfield or a Chicago suburb, carried there by atmospheric and oceanic transport pathways that moved the persistent compound through global circulation systems over years and decades. Antarctic penguin populations showed measurable DDT concentrations. Deep ocean sediment samples taken decades after the ban still showed DDT residues at detectable levels. The compound, that had been marketed as a domestic convenience, something a housewife in Cleveland could spray on her kitchen surfaces on a Tuesday morning, had distributed itself through the global environment with a thoroughness that bore no relationship to the localized intention of any individual application. The bald eagle, which had been reduced to a breeding population of fewer than 500 pairs in the lower 48 states by the early 1970s, largely as a consequence of DDT-induced reproductive failure, recovered to the point where it was removed from the federal endangered species list in 2007, 35 years after the ban. The recovery required active intervention through captive breeding programs, habitat protection, and continued monitoring of nesting populations. And it proceeded slowly enough that the generation of Americans who grew up after the ban reached adulthood before the species had fully stabilized. The osprey populations along the Atlantic coast followed a similar trajectory. The peregrine falcon, which had been functionally extirpated from the eastern United States by DDT-induced reproductive failure, returned to nest in cities including New York and Boston only after decades of reintroduction efforts that began in the 1970s and continued into the 1990s. For human populations, the health legacy of the DDT era proved more difficult to document precisely than the wildlife legacy, because human health effects operate on timescales and through mechanisms that are harder to isolate from the many other variables affecting human health across a population. The epidemiological literature that accumulated through the 1980s and 1990s established associations between DDT exposure and specific health outcomes, including non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, pancreatic cancer, and disruption of endocrine function. But the strength of those associations varied across studies, and the dose-response relationships were contested in ways that made definitive causal claims difficult to sustain against industry-funded counterargument. What proved less contestable because it rested on a more specific and traceable exposure pathway was the evidence that emerged from studies examining the children of women who had been pregnant during the peak years of DDT use. A landmark study published in the 2010s examined the daughters of women whose blood serum DDT concentrations had been measured during the 1960s as part of a prospective health study conducted in the San Francisco Bay Area of California. The daughters of women who had elevated DDT concentrations in their blood during pregnancy faced nearly 4 times the breast cancer risk by age 52 compared to the daughters of women with lower concentrations, a finding that directly implicated in utero DDT exposure rather than the daughter's own direct exposure as the primary risk factor. The mechanism proposed was endocrine disruption during fetal development. DDT's capacity to mimic estrogen in the body, interfering with the hormonal environment of the developing fetus at a stage when that environment shapes the biological architecture of tissues that will not become relevant to cancer risk for another 5 decades. That finding carries a particular weight in the larger story of the DDT era because it means that the health consequences of the advertising campaign that ran in 1947 were not fully visible until the 2010s. More than 60 years after the smiling housewife in the magazine illustration celebrated the miracle of modern chemistry over her kitchen surfaces. The children playing in the municipal spray truck fog in the summer of 1950 were reaching their early 50s when the research that quantified their elevated cancer risk was being published. The lag between exposure and consequence, which is one of the defining features of persistent organic pollutants as a category, is also the feature that made the DDT era possible in the first place, because a compound whose harms appeared within days of application would have been removed from the market by consumer response, rather than by regulatory action after decades of scientific documentation. The ban of 1972 closed the regulatory chapter of the DDT story in the United States, but it did not close the biological chapter, which continued in the bodies of the exposed generation and in the bodies of their children, and, as the multi-generational research suggests, in the bodies of their grandchildren as well. The compound that was marketed as perfectly safe for the family proved to be the opposite. But it proved it slowly enough that the proof arrived long after the marketing had done its work, and long after the old methods it had displaced were no longer the default practice of the American household. Barbara Cohn, a researcher at the Public Health Institute in Oakland, California, had access to something that most epidemiologists studying chemical exposures can only wish for: a biological sample bank from the right moment in history. Beginning in the early 1960s, a prospective health study conducted in the San Francisco Bay Area had collected and preserved blood serum samples from pregnant women, storing them in conditions that kept the samples viable for analysis decades after the original collection. Those samples captured the DDT concentration circulating in women's bodies during the peak years of domestic DDT use, when the compound was present in the American food supply, in household dust, in drinking water, and in the air of neighborhoods where municipal spray programs were operating on summer schedules. Cohn and her colleagues realized in the 2000s that those preserved samples represented a rare opportunity to answer a question that retrospective epidemiology almost never gets to ask cleanly: what happened to the daughters of those women? The study that resulted, published in the journal Environmental Health Perspectives, followed the daughters of the women whose blood had been sampled in the 1960s and measured their breast cancer rates against the DDT concentrations their mothers had carried during the pregnancies that produced them. The finding was specific enough to survive the scrutiny that followed its publication and to be replicated in subsequent analyses. Daughters born to women with the highest DDT concentrations in their blood faced a breast cancer risk by age 52 that was nearly 4 times higher than the risk faced by daughters born to women with the lowest concentrations. The exposure that produced this elevated risk was not the daughter's own direct contact with DDT. It was the in utero environment shaped by their mother's DDT burden during fetal development. The mechanism proposed to explain this finding moves through the endocrine system rather than through direct cellular damage of the kind associated with classic chemical carcinogens. DDT and its metabolites, particularly DDE, are classified as endocrine disrupting compounds, meaning they interfere with the hormonal signaling systems that regulate development, reproduction, and cellular growth across the body's organ systems. In a developing fetus, the hormonal environment during specific windows of gestation shapes the biological architecture of tissues, including breast tissue, in ways that influence that tissue's behavior for the entire subsequent life of the individual. An endocrine-disrupting compound present in the maternal bloodstream during those developmental windows does not need to cause direct DNA damage to influence cancer risk decades later. It needs only to alter the hormonal conditions under which the tissue develops, leaving the tissue with a biological architecture that is more vulnerable to malignant transformation when additional risk factors accumulate over a lifetime. This mechanism, called developmental programming or the fetal origins hypothesis in the broader epidemiological literature, has implications that extend well beyond DDT and that have reshaped the way environmental health researchers think about the timing of chemical exposures relative to their consequences. A compound that causes no measurable harm in an adult exposed to it may cause profound and lasting harm in a fetus exposed to it through maternal circulation during a critical developmental window, because the fetus and the adult are not biologically equivalent targets. The fetus is in the process of building systems that will operate for a lifetime, and an interference with that building process at a sensitive moment can alter the finished product in ways that no subsequent intervention can fully correct. The daughters in Cohn's study were not an unusual or specially selected population. They were ordinary American women whose mothers had ordinary American DDT exposures during the years when DDT was in the food supply, in the household environment, and in the bodies of virtually every pregnant woman in the country. The elevated risk documented in the study was not a consequence of exceptional exposure in a particularly contaminated location. It was a consequence of the background DDT burden that the American population carried during the compound's years of mainstream use, which means that the population affected by the multi-generational risk is not a small, identifiable subgroup, but a substantial fraction of the American women born during the late 1940s, the 1950s, and the early 1960s. Research published in subsequent years extended the multi-generational question to a third generation, examining whether the biological effects of in utero DDT exposure might be transmitted to the grandchildren of the originally exposed women through epigenetic mechanisms, changes in gene expression patterns that do not alter the underlying DNA sequence, but that can be passed from parent to offspring through the molecular machinery that controls which genes are active in which cells. The epigenetic transmission of environmentally induced changes in gene expression is an area of active research in which the evidence base is still developing, and claims in this area require more caution than the direct multi-generational findings from Cohn's study. What can be stated with confidence is that the research community investigating multi-generational effects of persistent organic pollutant exposure is substantial, active, and producing findings that consistently point in the direction of harms extending beyond the directly exposed generation. The timeline that emerges from the multi-generational research is one that the advertising of 1947 could not have encompassed even if its creators had wanted to be honest about it, because the consequences it documents were invisible at the timescale of a quarterly earnings report, an annual sales figure, or even a decade of product experience. The woman who sprayed her kitchen surfaces in 1949 and watched her children play in the municipal spray truck fog in the summer of 1951 could not have known, and had no means of knowing, that the biological consequences of those exposures might not be fully visible until her grandchildren reached their 50s in the 2010s. The advertising that told her the product was safe was not corrected by her experience of it, because her experience of it was genuinely unremarkable in the ways she could observe. What the multi-generational research ultimately documents is a category of harm that the regulatory and advertising frameworks of the post-war era were structurally incapable of detecting, because both frameworks evaluated products on timescales measured in months to years and in outcomes measurable in the directly exposed individual. A harm that skips a generation, that operates through the hormonal environment of fetal development rather than through direct toxicity to the exposed adult, and that does not become statistically visible in population data until the affected cohort reaches middle age, is not a harm that a 1940s safety assessment could have captured even in principle. The tools did not exist. The conceptual framework did not exist. The preserved blood samples that made Cohn's study possible did not yet exist. The harm existed, accumulating silently in the fatty tissue of a generation and in the developing tissue of the fetuses they carried, waiting for a research methodology that would not arrive for another 40 years. The old methods that DDT displaced did not accumulate in fatty tissue. They did not disrupt the endocrine environment of developing fetuses. They did not require a multi-generational epidemiological study to establish their safety profile, because the safety profile of diatomaceous earth, boric acid, and dried bay leaves had been established not by a formal research program but by continuous human use across generations that had no particular reason to continue using things that harmed them. That continuity of use is not a scientific credential in the formal sense, but it is a form of evidence that deserves acknowledgement alongside the peer-reviewed literature, because it represents an accumulated human experiment conducted at a scale and over a duration that no formal study has ever matched. The question that this history raises, and that deserves a direct answer, is why the old methods faded when they did. The answer is not that they stopped working. The answer is considerably simpler and considerably more instructive about the relationship between practical knowledge and economic incentive, and it begins with the property that diatomaceous earth, boric acid, and dried bay leaves share with each other and share with nothing in the synthetic pesticide industry. None of them can be patented. In the spring of 1946, a chemist working for a major American agricultural company could sit down with a novel synthetic molecule, file a patent application with the United States Patent Office, and emerge on the other side of that process with a legal instrument that gave the company exclusive rights to manufacture and sell that molecule as a commercial product for 17 years. That instrument was not merely a legal protection for intellectual property in the abstract sense. It was the foundation of an entire business model, one in which the cost of developing, testing, and registering a new pesticide compound could be recovered through the premium pricing that exclusivity permits, and in which the expiration of the patent created an incentive to develop the next novel molecule before competitors could manufacture the old one cheaply. The patent was the engine of the synthetic pesticide industry's economic structure, and without it, the industry as it existed in the post-war decades would not have been possible. Diatomaceous earth cannot be patented. It is a naturally occurring mineral substance mined from geological deposits that predate human civilization by hundreds of millions of years. And naturally occurring substances in their unmodified form are not eligible for patent protection under United States intellectual property law. Boric acid cannot be patented for the same reason. It is a naturally derived compound whose chemical identity has been known to science since the 18th century, and whose pest control properties were documented in the entomological literature decades before the post-war industry was assembled. Dried bay leaves, bay laurel essential oil, and the eucalyptal and linalool compounds they contain are equally outside the reach of patent protection, because they are natural products whose composition and activity belong to no inventor and to no company. This shared property of non-patentability does not mean that no one sells these materials commercially, because hardware stores and grocery suppliers do sell them, and the companies that package and distribute them earn a margin on that sale. What it means is that no company selling diatomaceous earth can prevent a competitor from selling the same material tomorrow, which keeps prices low, prevents the development of the kind of brand premium that a patented product can command, and eliminates the economic incentive to invest heavily in marketing the material to the consumer. A company that spends $5 million advertising diatomaceous earth as a pest control agent benefits its competitors exactly as much as it benefits itself, because any consumer persuaded by that advertising can buy the same material from any of a dozen competing suppliers. The economic logic of heavy advertising investment does not apply to non-patentable commodity materials, and so the heavy advertising investment does not happen. The consequence of that economic logic, played out across the post-war decades, was a profound asymmetry in the information environment available to the American household making pest control decisions. On one side of that asymmetry sat the synthetic pesticide industry, with its patent-protected products, its premium margins, its advertising budgets measured in millions of dollars annually, its relationships with agricultural extension services that it cultivated through funding and product donation, and its capacity to place salespeople in every hardware store in the country. On the other side sat three commodity materials whose combined annual marketing budget was, in any practical sense, zero, whose advocates were grandmothers and old farmers rather than professional sales representatives, and whose mechanism of transmission to new households was the kind of informal knowledge sharing between neighbors and generations that the post-war era was actively devaluing in favor of expert advice delivered through institutional channels. The informal knowledge-sharing networks that had transmitted the old farmhouse methods across generations were not destroyed by the synthetic pesticide industry. They were simply outcompeted in a changed information environment. A young woman setting up her first household in the suburbs of Cincinnati in 1952 received her pest control information from magazine advertisements, from the hardware store employee whose counter was stocked with DDT formulations, from the extension service bulletins that the agricultural chemical industry had cultivated relationships with, and from the broader cultural message that modernity and science were superior to tradition and grandmotherly advice. The grandmother's method was still available, still effective, and still costs almost nothing. It simply lost the competition for attention in a media environment that was not neutral between patented products with advertising budgets and unpatentable commodities with none. Robert Metcalf, an entomologist at the University of Illinois who spent his career studying the relationship between pest management practices and the economic structures that shaped them, wrote in the 1980s about what he called the pesticide treadmill, the tendency of synthetic pesticide use to generate the conditions of its own continuation by creating resistance in target populations that required new compounds, which created new resistance, which required newer compounds, in a cycle that served the economic interests of the industry, producing the compounds regardless of whether it served the interests of the households and farms paying for them. Metcalfe's analysis was not anti-science or anti-chemistry in any general sense. It was an economic observation about the structural incentives of an industry built on patent exclusivity and the recurring need for new products that patent expiration created. The old farmhouse methods were immune to the pesticide treadmill for the same reason they were immune to patent protection. Their mechanisms do not create selection pressure for resistance. Diatomaceous earth has been in contact with insect populations for longer than human civilization has existed, and no insect population has developed resistance to it, because resistance to a physical abrasive is not a biological pathway that evolution has available to it. Boric acid has been registered as a pesticide since 1948, which means that insect populations have been encountering it in treated environments for more than 75 years, and the entomological literature does not document the development of meaningful resistance to it in any major household pest species. Bay leaf essential oils have been present in human food storage environments for thousands of years across multiple continents, and the stored product pests that those environments were designed to exclude are still deterred by the same volatile compounds that deterred them in a Roman grain store 2,000 years ago. The economic argument for replacing unpatentable commodity materials with patented synthetic compounds did not require any individual actor to make a conscious decision to suppress the old methods. It required only that the economic incentives consistently point in one direction, while the non-economic incentives, tradition, informal knowledge networks, household cost savings, and the accumulated evidence of generations of effective use, received no institutional support and no organized voice in the information environment. The old methods faded not because they were proven ineffective, but because effectiveness was never the criterion by which the information environment of the post-war American household was organized. The criterion was economic, and by an economic criterion that rewarded patent exclusivity and advertising investment, 3 cheap, effective, and unpatentable materials were always going to lose the competition for shelf space and consumer attention. What did not fade, because it could not be removed from the scientific record even when it was absent from the consumer information environment, was the documentation of the mechanisms. The university extension services at land-grant institutions continued to publish accurate information about diatomaceous earth, boric acid, and plant-derived repellents throughout the decades of synthetic pesticide dominance, not as a preservation effort, but simply as part of the continuous work of documenting what works in integrated pest management. That documentation was always there, in the extension bulletins of the University of Minnesota and Colorado State, in the databases of the National Pesticide Information Center, in the registration records of the Environmental Protection Agency. It was never hidden. It was simply not advertised, which in the post-war American information environment amounted to the same thing for most households. The knowledge that the old farmhouse preserved was not secret knowledge. It was unfunded knowledge, and unfunded knowledge in a media environment dominated by funded knowledge occupies a position that feels like obscurity even when it is technically available to anyone who looks for it. The looking, in most cases, never happened, because the funded knowledge was already present in every hardware store, every magazine, and every extension agent's recommended product list before the unfunded knowledge had a chance to compete for attention. That asymmetry is the full and sufficient explanation for why a practice that worked, that was cheap, that was safe, and that was documented in the scientific literature throughout its period of apparent obsolescence came to feel like something that needed to be rediscovered rather than simply continued. Walk into the digital archive of the University of Minnesota Extension Service on any given afternoon and search for diatomaceous earth, and what comes back is not a collection of cautious, hedged references to a marginal folk practice. What comes back is direct, practical and specific guidance on a material that the Extension Service treats as a legitimate and well-documented pest control option for residential use, applicable to a range of common household insects including ants, cockroaches, bedbugs, and stored product pests. The guidance describes the mechanism, notes the food-grade versus pool-grade distinction as a safety matter of genuine importance, specifies that the material must be kept dry to remain effective, and places it within the broader framework of integrated pest management as a low-toxicity option with a strong safety profile for use around food and animals. None of this is new. None of it was added to the extension literature recently in response to renewed consumer interest. It has been there consistently throughout the decades when the consumer information environment was dominated by synthetic pesticide advertising. The Colorado State Extension Service covers boric acid in comparable detail, documenting its registration history, its non-repellent property, its mechanism of action against cockroaches and ants, and its colony-level effectiveness through the trophylactic transfer mechanism. The Colorado State guidance is specific about concentration, noting that the material is most effective at low concentrations that allow foraging individuals to survive long enough to return to the colony. And it is honest about the material's limits, stating plainly that boric acid does not reach egg cases, and that deeply established infestations in wall voids require additional intervention beyond surface-level applications. The guidance does not present boric acid as a universal solution. It presents it as a well-documented tool with a specific and understood mechanism, appropriate limitations, and a safety profile that makes it suitable for residential use without professional assistance. The National Pesticide Information Center, which is operated by Oregon State University in cooperation with the Environmental Protection Agency, and represents one of the most carefully sourced and consistently updated databases of pesticide information available to the American public, carries detailed fact sheets on both diatomaceous earth and boric acid. The fact sheets document the registration histories, the mechanisms of action, the safety profiles, and the environmental fate of both materials in language that is accessible to a general reader while remaining precise enough to satisfy a professional inquiry. The NPIC fact sheet on boric acid, for instance, specifies that products containing it have been registered in the United States since 1948, and that more than 500 registered products currently contain it as an active ingredient, a figure that represents not the fringe of pest management practice, but one of its most durable and consistently supported components. The Environmental Protection Agency's own registration records for diatomaceous earth place it in a category that the agency calls mechanical insecticides, a designation that reflects the genuine categorical difference between a material that kills through physical action and one that kills through chemical interference with biological processes. That designation is not a technicality. It is the regulatory acknowledgement of the resistance argument, the recognition that a material which kills mechanically rather than chemically does not create the selection pressure for resistance that chemical insecticides do, and that its effectiveness is therefore not subject to the degradation over time that resistance development imposes on chemical formulations. The EPA's registration of diatomaceous earth as a food contact surface treatment in grain storage facilities, in food processing plants, and in residential food storage areas reflects a safety determination that no synthetic pesticide registered for similar use can match without substantially more complex labeling restrictions. Peer-reviewed journals in the fields of entomology and pest management have produced a consistent body of literature on all three materials across the past several decades. The 2024 study in pest management science that used open-flow respirometry and scanning electron microscopy to document diatomaceous earth's mechanism of action at the level of cuticular and respiratory water loss is not an outlier in a thin literature. It is a recent contribution to a body of research that includes studies from the 1980s documenting boric acid's colony-level effects on cockroach populations, studies from the 1990s and 2000s examining the repellent activity of bay laurel essential oils against stored product pests, and a continuous thread of resistance research demonstrating the absence of meaningful resistance development in target populations exposed to both diatomaceous earth and boric acid over extended periods. The honest boundaries in that literature are as important as the confirmations, because a channel or a publication that presents only the confirmations and ignores the limitations is doing exactly what the synthetic pesticide advertising of the 1940s did, selecting the evidence that supports the narrative and suppressing the evidence that complicates it. Boric acid does not reach egg cases. Diatomaceous earth is temporarily disabled by moisture. Bay leaf's repellent activity diminishes as the essential oil content of the dried material volatilizes over months. Cedar's reputation as a moth repellent has a basis in the volatile compounds produced by fresh cedar wood, but the claim that a cedar chest maintains effective repellent activity for decades is not supported by the available evidence because the volatile compounds responsible for the repellent effect diminish as the wood ages and its surface oils are depleted. The extension literature that documents what works also documents these limits, and the limits are part of what makes the documentation trustworthy. The question of cedar and natural wood oils deserves a specific honest treatment because it occupies a space in the traditional pest management repertoire that sits between the well-documented and the folkloric. Cedar closets and cedar chests are a genuine part of American and European domestic tradition, and the basis for their use is real. Fresh cedar wood releases volatile terpenoid compounds, including cedrol and thujopsine, that have documented repellent activity against clothes, moths, and carpet beetles, the two species most likely to damage stored wool and natural fiber textiles. Laboratory studies confirm that freshly milled cedar produces volatile concentrations sufficient to deter these species in enclosed spaces. What the laboratory studies do not confirm, and what the traditional account sometimes claims, is that this activity persists for decades in a cedar chest or closet without any intervention. The volatile compounds responsible for the activity are depleted over time as they escape the wood surface, and a cedar chest that has not been sanded or treated with cedar oil in many years is providing a pleasant cedar scent and very little else in terms of active pest deterrents. Lightly sanding the interior surface of an old cedar chest to expose fresh wood beneath the depleted surface layer restores the volatile activity, as does applying cedar oil to the interior surfaces. That practical maintenance step is not always included in the traditional account, and its omission is the difference between a tradition with a genuine scientific basis and a superstition. Clove oil and the eugenol it contains occupy a more firmly documented position than cedar in the extension and regulatory literature. The Environmental Protection Agency classifies eugenol as a minimum-risk pesticide active ingredient, which is a specific regulatory category reserved for compounds with a history of safe use and a documented mode of action. The documented mode of action for eugenol includes activity against the octopamine receptor system of insects, a neurological target with no close equivalent in the mammalian nervous system, which is why compounds active at this receptor can be effective insecticidal agents without posing the neurological risks to humans and other mammals that compounds acting on shared neurological targets present. Clove oil applied to door frame surfaces, window sill edges, and the gap between a door frame and exterior siding provides both the olfactory deterrent component and a contact insecticidal component that the dried bay leaves alone do not deliver at the same concentration. The door frame itself deserves attention as a structural feature that the extension literature on insect entry routes identifies as a primary pathway rather than a secondary concern. The gap between a door frame and the surrounding wall structure, the seam between the frame and the door jamb, the space around the hinge hardware where the frame has been penetrated by fasteners, and the gap at the base of the frame where it meets the threshold are all locations where insect traffic concentrates precisely because they represent the smallest and most protected openings in the building envelope. An insect navigating the exterior of a building in search of an entry point is not moving randomly across the entire wall surface. It is following thermal gradients, air currents carrying interior odors, and the physical geometry of gaps and edges. The door frame, with its multiple seams and its regular disturbance by human traffic that creates air movement signaling the interior, is the primary destination for that navigation, which is exactly why treating the frame itself rather than only the threshold beneath it is a logical extension of the entry point approach. The full picture that emerges from the extension literature, the regulatory records, and the peer-reviewed research is of 3 materials that are genuinely well-documented, genuinely effective within their understood limits, genuinely safe within the distinctions that the literature specifies, and genuinely inexpensive relative to every alternative available to the American household for managing the same pest control challenge. The picture also includes honest limits, materials like cedar that have a basis but require maintenance to remain active, claims that the traditional account sometimes makes that the scientific record does not fully support, and boundary conditions like moisture sensitivity and egg case impermeability that define where each material works and where it does not. That complete picture, confirmations, and limits together is the one that the old farmhouse preserved in practice, and that the extension literature preserved in documentation, throughout the decades when the consumer information environment was occupied almost entirely by something very different. A woman named Sarah, living in a mid-sized house on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, opens an envelope on a Thursday afternoon in March and finds her quarterly pest control invoice inside it. The amount is $87, which is the per-visit charge under the annual contract she signed 18 months ago, when she noticed what turned out to be a small ant trail along the baseboard of her kitchen. Over the course of the year, 4 quarterly visits at $87 each produce a total of $348, and that figure does not include the one-time initial inspection fee of $120 that the contract required before service began, bringing her first-year total to $468. The contract renews automatically unless she cancels in writing 30 days before the renewal date, a detail that appears in paragraph 7 of the service agreement in a font size that required her to move closer to the page to read it. The National Pest Management Association, the primary industry trade organization for the professional pest control sector in the United States, reports that the domestic pest control market generates revenues in the range of $23 to $26 billion annually across all service categories. Residential recurring contracts represent the largest single revenue segment within that total, meaning that the economic engine of the industry runs not on one-time treatments, but on the subscription model that Sarah's envelope represents. The subscription model is, from a business perspective, the most stable and predictable revenue structure available to a service company, because it converts a discretionary purchase that a customer might make once, and then reconsider into a recurring obligation that requires active effort to cancel. The fact that the service being subscribed to manages rather than resolves the underlying problem is, within this business model, a feature rather than a defect. Set Sarah's $468 against the cost of assembling the 3-layer entry point system for a house of comparable size, with 6 to 8 entry points requiring treatment. Food-grade diatomaceous earth in a 2-pound bag, sufficient for a complete initial treatment of all entry points with material remaining for 2 full seasonal reapplications. Retails at most hardware stores and online suppliers for between $8 and $12. Boric acid powder in a 1-pound container, again sufficient for a complete initial treatment with reapplication material remaining. Retails for between $5 and $10. Dried bay leaves in a 2-ounce package from a grocery store spice supplier cost between $2 and $4 and provide enough material for a complete initial placement at all entry points with replacement material for 1 full seasonal refresh. Clove oil in a small bottle from a pharmacy or natural food store runs between $4 and $8 and provides enough material for multiple application cycles at a standard residential property. The total for all 4 materials at the upper end of the retail price ranges given is $34. That $34 figure does not renew automatically. It does not require a signed contract with a cancellation provision in paragraph 7. It does not depend on a quarterly visit from a technician whose schedule may or may not align with the timing of an emerging pest problem. It requires approximately 90 minutes of the household's own time for the initial application and approximately 45 minutes for each seasonal refresh, which over the course of a full year represents a time investment of roughly 2.5 hours. The 4 quarterly visits under Sarah's service contract also require the household's time, in the form of being present to admit the technician, moving furniture and clearing treated areas before the visit, and remaining out of treated areas for the period specified in the service agreement after the application. The time investment difference between the two approaches is not as large as the cost difference. The reapplication economics over a 3-year period illustrate the contrast more starkly than a single-year comparison does. Sarah's service contract, renewing at $348 per year after the first year's initial fee, produces a 3-year total of somewhere between $1,064 and $1,204 depending on whether the company applies annual price increases. The 3-layer system, requiring a full materials refresh once per year at an average cost of $20 to $30 for replacement bay leaves, diatomaceous earth, and boric acid, produces a 3-year total of between $60 and $90, inclusive of the initial purchase. The difference between those 3-year totals is between $974 and $1,114, which is a range within which a household could purchase a very good set of kitchen appliances, a season of heating fuel, or approximately 3 years of groceries for one person. The cost comparison becomes more instructive still when the outcome delivered by each approach is examined alongside the price. Sarah's contract delivers quarterly applications of synthetic pyrethroid compounds to the interior perimeter of her home, which reduce the forager population visible in the treated areas for a period of several weeks before new foragers from the undisturbed colony replenish the visible population. The contract's implicit promise, which is that the household will not have an insect problem, is structurally impossible for the service to deliver because the service treats the visible population rather than the source population, and the source population is in a wall void that the quarterly visit does not reach. Sarah knows this, on some level, because the ant trail that prompted her to sign the contract in the first place reappears each spring, prompting a service call, which is also covered by the contract, which is also why the contract exists. The 3-layer system, applied at the entry points before the spring foraging season begins, addresses the source population through the boric acid mechanism, while the diatomaceous earth layer destroys individual foragers attempting the threshold crossing, and the bay leaf layer reduces the number of foragers that attempt the crossing in the first place. The system does not guarantee that no insect will ever enter the structure, because no pest control approach of any kind at any price point can make that guarantee honestly. What it does is address the problem at a fundamentally different scale than the quarterly spray, targeting the colony rather than the forager, the entry point rather than the interior surface, the source rather than the symptom. The hardware store at which Sarah could purchase all 4 materials is, in most American cities and suburbs, within the same commercial area as the pest control company whose invoice she is opening. The materials are on the shelf, priced and labeled, available without a contract or a service agreement or a cancellation provision in paragraph 7. The information about how to use them effectively is in the extension literature of the University of Minnesota and Colorado State, in the fact sheets of the National Pesticide Information Center, and in the registration records of the Environmental Protection Agency. Nothing about this system is restricted, proprietary, or difficult to access. The gap between what Sarah is spending and what she could spend is not a gap in availability. It is a gap in information, specifically the gap created by 4 decades of advertising investment behind the quarterly contract model and 0 advertising investment behind the commodity materials that predate it. The bigger picture that this cost gap opens onto is not merely a story about pest control or about 3 cheap materials and 1 expensive service. It is a story about what happens to practical knowledge when the economic structure of an information environment consistently rewards one kind of answer and consistently provides no reward for another. That story has a pattern that repeats well beyond the specific case of pest management, and recognizing the pattern in this specific case is the beginning of being able to recognize it in others. The DDT era is the most dramatic illustration of that pattern available in the pest control domain. But the pattern itself is older than DDT, more durable than any single product cycle, and more consequential than the cost of any individual service contract. Understanding it fully requires one final piece of the picture, which is the larger question of what an industry with a financial interest in replacing practical knowledge actually does to that knowledge over time, and what the households on the receiving end of that replacement can do about it. In the winter of 1953, a farmer outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, named William, had a conversation with his county agricultural extension agent that would have been unremarkable in the decade before it, but that reflected something new in the decade it actually occurred. William had asked about the diatomaceous earth and boric acid treatment his father had used at every entry point of the farmhouse for 30 years, and specifically whether it was still worth doing alongside the new synthetic pyrethroid products the agent had been recommending. The agent's answer was not hostile to the old method. It was simply indifferent to it in a way that communicated its cultural status clearly. The old method was what people had done before the new products existed, and now that the new products existed, the old method was a matter of personal preference rather than practical necessity. The agent had no financial relationship with any pesticide company. He was not corrupt or dishonest. He was operating within an information environment that had been shaped by a decade of industry investment in exactly the kind of indifference his answer expressed. The mechanism by which an industry reshapes a professional information environment without corrupting any individual within it is one of the more important and least discussed phenomena in the history of consumer markets. It does not require bribery, suppression, or conspiracy, because those methods are both expensive and legally risky. What it requires is something considerably cheaper and more durable: the consistent, long-term investment in the information channels through which professionals receive their understanding of what constitutes current best practice. Agricultural extension services in the post-war period received product samples, funded research trials, and the presence of professional sales representatives who were knowledgeable, helpful, and selling something. The extension agents who worked with those representatives were not being manipulated in any simple sense. They were being educated in a curriculum whose content was shaped by the economic interests of those providing it. The result of that education, accumulated across a profession over a decade, is not that individual agents became dishonest, but that the collective professional common sense of the field shifted in the direction that the education pointed. What was current, what was effective, what was worth recommending, became synonymous with what the industry was producing and promoting, not because the industry's products were always superior, but because the industry was the only entity investing in the communication infrastructure that defined currency and effectiveness for the profession. The old methods had no sales representatives, no funded research trials demonstrating their effectiveness in the current season's pest populations, and no presence in the professional development materials that extension agents received. Their absence from those materials was not a conspiracy. It was the predictable consequence of an economic asymmetry that required no coordination to produce. This pattern has repeated in domains far removed from pest control, and recognizing it in the pest control case makes it easier to identify elsewhere. In the middle decades of the 20th century, the American medical profession's understanding of optimal infant nutrition shifted substantially toward commercial formula and away from breastfeeding, not because clinical evidence demonstrated the superiority of formula, but because formula manufacturers invested heavily in the medical education infrastructure, providing samples to hospitals, funding research on formula composition, and placing company representatives in the offices of pediatricians. The shift in professional common sense that resulted was not a corruption of the profession. It was a predictable response to an asymmetry in educational investment between a commercial interest with a product to sell and a traditional practice with no commercial infrastructure behind it. The parallel is not exact, and overstating it would do a disservice to the genuine complexity of both cases. Formula feeding has legitimate applications that breastfeeding cannot always serve, just as synthetic pesticides have applications that the old farmhouse methods cannot serve, particularly in cases of severe established infestation in wall voids. The point is not that the commercial product is always inferior to the traditional practice, because that is not true in either case. The point is that the information environment available to the professional and the consumer is shaped by investment patterns that have nothing to do with comparative effectiveness and everything to do with what can be patented, sold under a brand name, and marketed through the communication infrastructure that commercial investment can sustain. John Kenneth Galbraith, the Canadian-American economist who taught at Harvard and wrote extensively about the relationship between corporate power and consumer behavior in the post-war decades, described the process by which industrial advertising creates what he called the dependence effect, the systematic generation of wants that would not exist without the advertising that creates them, and the corresponding suppression of satisfaction with needs that can be met without commercial intermediation. Galbraith was writing primarily about consumer goods in the broad sense, but his analysis applies with particular precision to the pest control case, where the quarterly service contract is a product that generates its own demand by treating visible symptoms rather than underlying causes, and where the alternative that meets the underlying need without commercial intermediation has been rendered invisible, not by force, but by the simple absence of the advertising investment that makes things visible in a consumer information environment. The practical knowledge that the old farmhouse preserved was not, in the terms Galbraith would have used, a want created by advertising. It was a need met by experience, transmitted through the informal networks of family and community rather than through the commercial communication infrastructure that the post-war period substituted for those networks. When the commercial infrastructure became dominant and the informal networks weakened under the pressure of suburban dispersal, geographic mobility, and the cultural devaluation of traditional knowledge in favor of expert advice, the practical knowledge that the informal networks carried did not disappear from the world. It retreated into the communities that had maintained the informal networks most consistently, the rural households, the Amish communities, the old farming families in regions where the post-war suburban transformation had arrived more slowly or less completely. Those communities did not preserve the old methods as a cultural statement or a rejection of modernity. They preserved them because the methods worked, because the economics of farming made the cost difference between a $15 annual treatment and a $400 service contract meaningful in a way that it was less immediately meaningful to a suburban household with a service contract as a line item in a comfortable budget. And because the informal knowledge networks through which the methods had always been transmitted remained intact in communities where the social geography of daily life had not been reorganized by suburban dispersal. The Amish household that applies diatomaceous earth, boric acid, and bay leaves at every entry point each spring is not making an ideological choice about technology. It is making a practical choice about what works, informed by a knowledge tradition that the commercial information environment of the post-war decades never successfully penetrated. What the research literature, the extension documentation, and the regulatory record together establish is that the practical choice those communities made was correct, not merely in the traditional sense of having worked for generations, but in the scientific sense of resting on mechanisms that peer-reviewed research has confirmed and that the Environmental Protection Agency has recognized in its registration categories. The knowledge that retreated into the old farmhouse and the Amish community was not folk wisdom in the sense of untested belief. It was applied science in the sense of practice derived from observation of outcomes and transmitted as reliable technique, waiting for the formal scientific vocabulary that would eventually describe its mechanisms in the language of respirometry, trophallaxis, and octopamine receptor activity. The question that this larger picture raises for anyone watching this account is not merely what to put at the doorframe this weekend, though that is a genuinely useful question with a genuinely practical answer. The larger question is how to evaluate the information environment in which pest control decisions and the many other practical decisions that share the same structural features are made. The evaluation does not require cynicism about all commercial products, because some commercial products are genuinely superior to their alternatives, and the commercial investment in communicating their effectiveness is therefore doing the consumer a service. It requires only the habit of asking when a traditional practice has been displaced by a commercial alternative, whether the displacement reflects a genuine improvement in outcome or an asymmetry in the investment available to communicate the case for each option. That habit of inquiry is, in a very practical sense, the most durable thing this account has to offer, and it costs even less than a bag of diatomaceous earth. The question of where to begin is the one that most people arrive at by the end of an account like this one, and it deserves a direct answer rather than a general encouragement to try everything at once. Beginning with all 3 layers simultaneously on the first attempt is not wrong, but it is also not necessary. And the person who attempts a complete application of all 3 materials at every entry point of a large house in a single afternoon, before they have a clear sense of what each material looks and feels like in application, is the person most likely to apply too much of one thing, too little of another, and come away with an experience that does not reflect what the system actually does when it is applied correctly. The better starting point is a single entry point and a single material, chosen for the clarity of the demonstration it provides. Start with the diatomaceous earth at the entry point you use most frequently, which in most households is the back door or the kitchen entry from a garage or mudroom. Apply a thin line of food-grade diatomaceous earth across the interior threshold and along the base of the interior door frame on both sides, keeping the line narrow enough that the floor surface beneath it remains faintly visible. Leave it in place for 2 weeks without disturbing it, checking after any mopping or cleaning of the area and reapplying where the line has been disrupted. At the end of 2 weeks, most households that have done this correctly report a visible reduction in the small insect traffic that was previously crossing that threshold. The tiny ants that appear in spring, the occasional beetle from the garden, the moth that follows the kitchen light. The reduction is not dramatic in the way a contact spray is dramatic, because no individual death event is visible to the naked eye. What is visible is an absence, and the absence is the point. Once the diatomaceous earth application is established and the household has a clear sense of what the material looks like in a correct application, add the bay leaves at the exterior face of the same entry point. Tuck 3 to 4 dried leaves into the gap between the exterior door frame and the siding, or lay them flat on the exterior sill if the frame sits flush, and replace them when they have dried to a pale, brittle state that suggests the essential oil content has largely volatilized, typically after 3 to 4 months under outdoor conditions. If clove oil is available, 2 drops on a small cotton pad placed alongside the bay leaves adds the eugenol layer without requiring a separate application step and perceptibly strengthens the volatile field at the entry point during the first weeks before the bay leaves have fully established their own contribution. Add the boric acid layer last, placing it in the interior gap between the door frame base and the flooring, and in any visible crack or seam in the baseboard adjacent to the entry point, after the diatomaceous earth and bay leaf applications have been in place long enough that the household is comfortable with the maintenance requirements of both. The boric acid application is the most durable of the 3, and the least likely to be disturbed by normal household activity if it is placed in protected gaps rather than on open floor surfaces, which means that once it is correctly placed, it requires the least ongoing attention of the 3 materials. The sequence from diatomaceous earth to bay leaves to boric acid is the sequence that builds the household's familiarity with the system in the order of visibility, from the most visible material to the least visible, and from the mechanism with the most immediate observable effect to the mechanism whose most important effects happen out of sight over a period of weeks. The seasonal maintenance calendar that emerges from a complete 3-layer application is simpler than the initial setup implies. At the beginning of spring, before the foraging season for the ant species most common in the region begins, refresh all diatomaceous earth applications at every entry point, reapply or replace all bay leaf placements, and check all boric acid placements for moisture exposure or physical disturbance. At the beginning of autumn, repeat the same refresh before the season in which insects seeking overwintering sites begin their approach to residential structures. 2 full refresh cycles per year, each requiring approximately 45 minutes for a standard residential property, constitute the complete annual maintenance requirement for the system. The bay leaf replacement at the grocery store, the diatomaceous earth refresh from the remaining material in the original bag, and the occasional boric acid touch-up in disturbed gaps represent the complete annual materials cost, which in most years will fall below $20 for a property with 6 to 8 entry points. The comment that this account most wants to hear from the people who watch it is not a confirmation of what has been presented here, but a specific report. Which entry point did you start with? what did you observe after 2 weeks, and did an older relative, a grandparent or a great-aunt or a neighbor who had lived in the same farmhouse for 50 years ever show you something similar without explaining why it worked? Those reports, gathered across the households that watch this account and try the system, constitute a form of distributed observation that no single household can produce on its own, and they are the raw material of exactly the kind of informal knowledge transmission that the old farmhouse methods depended on before the post-war information environment interrupted that transmission. The comment section is not a perfect substitute for a grandmother's kitchen, but it is the functional equivalent available in this moment, and it is worth using. Beyond the immediate practical question of what to put at the doorframe this weekend, the larger invitation this account extends is to apply the habit of inquiry that the DDT story makes necessary to every domain where a traditional practice has been displaced by a commercial alternative. The displacement is not always unjustified. Sometimes the commercial alternative genuinely is superior, and the traditional practice was displaced because it deserved to be. But the habit of asking which is the case, of checking whether the extension literature and the regulatory record support the commercial alternative's claims, of looking at the economic structure behind the information environment that made the alternative seem obviously preferable, is a habit that costs nothing and that consistently returns something of value. It returned, in this case, a $15 annual solution to a $400 annual problem, and that is a return worth sharing. Share this account with one person who is currently paying for a quarterly pest control service, not to tell them they are wrong to be doing so, because the service is doing something real even if it is not doing the thing that would actually resolve the problem, but to give them a comparison they have probably never been offered, and that the information environment around them has no financial incentive to offer. The sharing is itself a form of the knowledge transmission that the old farmhouse depended on. The passing of a practical technique from one household to another through a network of personal trust rather than through a commercial communication infrastructure. That network is still available. It has simply moved, as everything else has moved, from the fence between two farms outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to the share button at the bottom of a screen. The mechanism of transmission has changed. The value of what is being transmitted has not. Subscribe if this account's approach to the intersection of practical knowledge and economic history is the kind of thing you want more of, because there are 21 additional techniques in the same tradition waiting in the archive, each one grounded in the same combination of extension literature, regulatory documentation, and peer-reviewed research that this account has rested on throughout. Each one carries the same honest boundaries around what is confirmed and what is folklore, the same real cost comparisons against the commercial alternatives that displace the traditional practice, and the same larger question about the information environment that shaped which option most households encounter first. The next account begins where this one has left the door open, at the gap between what the scientific record documents and what the consumer information environment communicates, which is, as this account has shown, a gap large enough to drive a very expensive quarterly service contract through.